The American Civil War, a nation torn apart. Brothers forced to face brothers, ideals clashing in thunderous battle, and a land forever changed by fire and blood. Before the first shot echoed across Fort Sumter, before the smoke darkened the skies of Gettysburg, the seeds of conflict were already sown, deep within the soul of a young republic. This is the story of a house divided, of courage and cruelty, of hope, heartbreak, and the relentless struggle for freedom. Join me as we journey back through the whispers of a storm, into the flames of a war that reshaped America forever. Chapter 1. Whispers of a Storm. The year is 1850. The United States stands at a crossroads, young, ambitious, divided. From the bustling streets of Boston to the cotton fields of Mississippi, a quiet storm is gathering. The land is growing, richer, more powerful, but also more fractured. There is pride in the nation's rapid rise, but there is fear too. Fear that its soul has begun to split. The Constitution, once a symbol of unity, now feels like a fragile pact, a delicate thread holding together two different Americas, one built on free labor, innovation, and industry, the other on slave, plantations, inherited wealth, and human bondage. Neither side speaks the same moral language anymore, neither sees the other clearly, and somewhere in between, the middle is vanishing. For decades, the country had survived on compromise, uneasy agreements, carefully drawn lines, and polite silence. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise had tried to hold the peace, admitting Missouri as a slave state, Maine as free and drawing a boundary across the nation. North of it, no slavery, south, tolerated. But that line was not a solution. It was a delay. Every new state, every new territory became a battlefield, not of guns, but of ideals. California's entry in 1850 threatened the balance again. The South watched nervously. The North, growing louder, demanded an end to slavery's expansion. And in response, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, a law that sent federal marshals into free states, dragging escaped slaves back to bondage. It was legal. It was enforceable. It was horrifying. In northern cities, resistance flared. In Boston, mobs clashed with marshals in the streets. In New York, abolitionist newspapers printed gruesome accounts of captured men and women, torn from their homes, returned in chains. Even those who had once stayed silent began to speak. And in the South, a different story was told. There, slavery was not a sin. It was an institution, a tradition, a way of life handed down through generations, defended with scripture, and woven into the economy. Southern leaders warned their people, the North wants to change your world. They want to end your freedom and to own others. In truth, neither side fully understood the other, and between them was a widening gulf of fear. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel that lit the fuse of conscience. It was fiction, but it read like gospel. Her words brought slavery into northern parlors and hearts. Mothers wept, preachers thundered, and in the South, outrage followed. Stowe was condemned. Her book was banned. The divide deepened. Then came Kansas. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, allowing settlers to vote on whether their new state would be free or slave. Popular sovereignty, they called it. But in practice, it was bloodshed. Both pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, armed and ready. Towns were burned, men were shot in the streets, families fled in terror. It was no longer politics, it was war in miniature. Bleeding Kansas, the newspapers called it, and the nation bled too. From this chaos emerged new faces, fierce voices who would define what was coming. One of them was a tall, quiet lawyer from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, not yet president, not yet famous. But in 1858, his debates with Senator Stephen Douglas drew national attention. Lincoln warned that a house divided against itself and cannot stand. He did not call for war, but he saw the path ahead. A nation could not endure, he argued, half slave and half free. His words echoed across America, admired in the North. feared in the South, and in that same year as another face appeared. But this one did not debate. He acted John Brown, a man possessed not by ambition but by faith. Brown believed slavery was a sin so great that only blood could cleanse. In 1859, he led a daring raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His plan was to arm enslaved people, spark a rebellion, and bring down slavery by force. It failed. Brown was captured, tried, and hanged, but his final words rang louder than his actions. He said, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land it will never be purged away but with blood." And across the South, fear turned to fury. They saw in Brown a sign that the North no longer wanted debate, but destruction. That abolition was not a cause, but a crusade. Then came the election of 1860. Lincoln ran on a simple promise: to halt the spread of slavery, not to end it where it existed, not yet, but to keep it from growing further west. To Southern ears, it was a death sentence. If slavery could not expand, it would die. And so the South made a choice. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union. One by one, others followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. The Confederate States of America were born, with their own flag, their own president, their own constitution, and their own vision of liberty. A liberty built on the right to enslave. In the North, shock turned to anger. Many still hoped for peace, but they also believed in the Union, not just as a government but as an idea. To let it break apart was to betray everything it stood for. Lincoln, now president, faced an impossible moment. He believed disunion was illegal, unthinkable, and yet that it was happening before his eyes. Still, there was no war, not yet. For months, the two sides circled one another, wary, waiting, armed, but still silent, until April 1861. In Charleston Harbor, a lonely outpost of Union soldiers remained, Fort Sumter. It was surrounded by Confederate forces, cut off from supplies. A symbol, nothing more. But symbols matter. Lincoln sent word. He would send ships, only food, not guns. The South refused to wait. At 4:30 a.m. on April 12th, Confederate artillery opened fire. The sky lit up with flame. The war had begun. But this is not yet that story. This is the story of how it all unraveled before the first cannon roared. The story of a country that grew too fast and ignored too much. The story of ideals that clashed with profit, of human dignity sacrificed to political convenience. A story of men and women, preachers and poets, merchants and farmers, who watched the storm roll in and chose sides, because long before the first bullet was fired, long before the first uniform was sewn, the American Civil War was already being fought, in hearts, in newspapers, in churches and courtrooms. It was a war of whispers, of warnings unheard, of storm clouds rising slowly, silently, over a land that refused to see them. And when the sky finally broke, it would break all at once, not just a battle for territory, but a battle for the very soul of the nation. That battle was coming, and it would not be kind. Chapter 2. The Great American Lie. They called it the Land of Liberty, a place where a man could speak his mind, worship freely, rise by his merit, a republic born not of kings and bloodlines, but of principles. Of all the promises etched into the founding of the United States, none burned brighter than the idea of freedom. But that promise was never whole. From its very birth, the United States carried a contradiction at its heart. The Declaration of Independence thundered that all men are created equal, even as its authors, men of vision and reason, owned other human beings. They wrote of liberty, while profiting from chains. They preached natural rights, while denying them to millions. It was not a secret, it was not hidden, it was accepted, built into the nation's bones. By the early 1800s, slavery had become more than an institution, it was a foundation. The Southern economy, rooted in vast plantations of cotton, sugar, tobacco, depended entirely on enslaved labor. By 1860, nearly 4 million people lived in bondage in the South, more than the population of every major American city combined. They were not citizens. They had no rights. They were property, bought, sold, branded, beaten, and bred. And the North was not innocent. Though slavery had been abolished in many northern states, the economic machinery of the entire country was entangled in its profits. Northern banks financed southern plantations. Northern textile mills spun cotton picked by southern slaves. Insurance companies issued policies on human lives, not for their well-being, but for their value. Even the U.S. Capitol was built in part by enslaved hands. America's prosperity, its roads, its railways, its global trade, bore the fingerprints of the enslaved. It was a truth many knew, but few would say. In southern towns, the system was justified with a quiet certainty. Ministers preached that the Bible did not forbid slavery, and in fact condoned it. Planters argued that they fed, clothed, and housed the enslaved better than the northern factories treated their workers. Paternalism became the mask worn by brutality. Children grew up never questioning it. Their lullabies were sung by enslaved women, their meals cooked by enslaved hands. Their wealth, passed down through generations, was inseparable from ownership. For them, this world was not just acceptable, it was natural, but for the enslaved, it was a living nightmare. Families were torn apart on auction blocks. Husbands sold away from wives, children ripped from mothers. There was no safety, no protection. The whip was law, and yet, in the darkness there was resistance, there was memory, there was dignity. Slaves created networks of secret learning. They passed down stories in hushed voices. They sang spirituals laced with coded messages, songs that pointed to freedom. Many tried to escape, fleeing northward, guided by stars and whispers, by the secret pathways of the Underground Railroad. It was not a literal train, but a movement of courage. Conductors like Harriet Tubman risked everything, returning again and again to lead people out of bondage. She carried a pistol, not to fight the slavers, but to urge terrified souls to press forward, even when fear threatened to consume them. Every journey north was a defiance, every step a declaration that they were not property, but people. Still, most would never escape. Most would die without ever knowing freedom. And even in the so-called free states, liberty was not complete. Black Americans, both freedmen and fugitives, lived under constant threat. They were denied the vote, denied schooling, denied dignity. They could be kidnapped in broad daylight and dragged back into slavery under federal law. In 1857, the Supreme Court of the United States delivered its most damning verdict, the Dred Scott decision. Scott, a black man who had lived in free territory, sued for his freedom. The court did not just rule against him, it ruled against his very humanity. Chief Justice Roger Taney declared that no black person, free or enslaved, could be a citizen. That they had, quote, no rights which the white man was bound to respect. With that stroke of a pen, the highest court in the land erased the Constitution's promise, not just for Scott, but for millions, and yet the myth endured. The myth that America was the land of liberty, that it stood alone among nations in its moral vision, that its flag waved for justice. It was a beautiful story, but it was also a lie, not to everyone, not always, but to enough, to too many. A lie that allowed good men to look away, that let northern merchants profit in silence, that let southern families justify horror with gentility. A lie that told the nation, this contradiction is survivable. This house, divided against itself, can still stand. But the contradiction was too large. Slavery wasn't just an economic system. It was a moral reckoning waiting to explode. And as the 1850s rolled on, the pressure built, in books, in pulpits, in speeches, in riots. In the North, abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, a former slave turned orator, held nothing back. He spoke with fire, with pain, with unrelenting truth. What to the American slave is your 4th of July, he asked. a day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. His words rang out and were ignored by many, but not by all. White abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison called the Constitution a pact with the devil. He burned it in public. Others, like the Grimke sisters, daughters of a wealthy Southern judge, turned against their own heritage, standing before crowds to condemn slavery as a crime against both God and country. Still, change came slowly. Politicians danced, newspapers deflected, and moderates, always the moderates, begged for patience. But how long can a nation delay its soul? How long can it ask millions to suffer in silence, for the comfort of a few? Every generation had pushed the reckoning further down the road. Until now, it could go no further. By 1860, the contradictions were no longer abstract. They were personal. Electoral maps split neatly along slavery's lines, churches broke into factions, political parties fractured and died, entire families no longer spoke. And behind every polite conversation was the quiet question no one wanted to answer. Can a nation that calls itself free also be built on bondage? In the South, the answer was clear, yes, proudly, boldly. In the North, the answer was murkier, yes, for a time. No, eventually, but in the hearts of the enslaved. There was only one answer, and it was not written in policy or court rulings or compromise. It was carved into the skin of those who had been whipped. It was buried with children, sold like cattle. It was sung every night by the fire in voices too tired to cry and too stubborn to surrender. The lie was being exposed. The illusion that two incompatible visions of America could live side by side was breaking. This was not just a clash of regions or economies or laws. This was a battle for meaning. What does freedom truly mean? Who gets to claim it? Who deserves it, and what price must be paid for to make it real? The nation had come of age believing it could be both, the land of liberty and the land of slavery, that it could speak of equality while denying it, that it could rise, unshackled, while chaining millions to the earth. But history has no patience for illusions. The reckoning had begun, quietly at first, in courtrooms and protests, in sermons and speeches, in whispered prayers and furious declarations. But soon it would grow louder, much louder. The lie was ending. And truth, soaked in blood, was coming. Chapter 3. When Words Failed. The American experiment was built on words, declarations, debates, documents, carefully chosen language to balance passion with reason, freedom with law. From Philadelphia's halls to frontier cabins, Americans believed that problems could be argued, compromised, solved, that the Republic, though imperfect, could always be negotiated into survival. But by the late 1850s, that faith began to die, because words, once the foundation of unity, had become weapons, each sentence sharpened, every speech a threat, no longer used to build bridges, but to dig trenches. The center had collapsed. The signs were everywhere. In the streets, in Congress, in the silence between neighbors who now crossed the road to avoid each other. The bonds of reason, those invisible threads that held republics together, had frayed until they were dust. It hadn't happened in a single moment. It never does. It had been a long erosion, year after year, compromise after compromise, a desperate attempt to bind two irreconcilable visions into one flag. But in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act tore open the last threadbare veil. Stephen Douglas, a powerful Illinois senator, proposed a bill that would allow settlers of new territories to vote on whether they'd allow slavery. Popular sovereignty, he called it. A democratic solution, he claimed. Let the people decide. But what it truly did was ignite a fire. It repealed the Missouri Compromise, that fragile line drawn decades earlier to keep slavery contained below a certain latitude. And with it gone, the western frontier became a battlefield of ideology. Kansas bled a territory That should have been quiet and new, filled with settlers and fields. Instead became the stage for civil war in miniature. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions flooded in, not to farm, but to fight. Towns were torched, election boxes were stuffed, men were dragged from homes and murdered in the dark. At Pottawatomie Creek, John Brown, with his sons, butchered 5 pro-slavery men with broadswords. Retaliation followed. Chaos became routine. In Washington, politicians argued about Kansas, while Kansas burned. This was not the democracy the founders had imagined. This was a preview of something worse. And behind the violence came silence. Silence from those who once believed in compromise. The great moderates of previous generations, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, were gone. And those who remained lacked their gravity. The political center, once occupied by Unionists who soothed tempers, was now a void. Into that vacuum poured extremists. In 1856, that chaos crossed into the Senate itself. Charles Sumner, a sharp-tongued abolitionist from Massachusetts, stood to speak. For 2 days he thundered against the Kansas crisis, condemning the rape of a virgin territory by what he called the harlot of slavery. He mocked Southern leaders by name, accusing them of moral rot and cowardice. He did not hold back, and the response was not a debate. It was violence. Preston Brooks, a congressman from South Carolina, and a relative of one of those Sumner had insulted, walked into the Senate chamber days later, calmly, quietly, and without a word. He raised a heavy cane and beat Sumner nearly to death on the Senate floor. He struck again and again, and over the head, the back, the shoulders, until the cane snapped in half. Sumner collapsed, bloodied and unconscious. No one stopped him. Some watched, some cheered. Sumner would not return to the Senate for 3 years. He would never fully recover. But across the South, Brooks was hailed as a hero. Supporters sent him canes engraved with phrases like, "Hit him again." It was a moment that shattered whatever illusion of civility still remained. Violence was no longer the last resort. It was becoming the first, and the parties followed suit. The Whig Party, once a major force in American politics, disintegrated under the pressure. It could not reconcile its northern and southern wings. By 1856, it was gone, splintered, directionless. In its place rose something new. The Republican Party, born in opposition to the spread of slavery, coalesced in the North. It attracted abolitionists, moderates, ex-Whigs, and disillusioned Democrats. Their message was clear: stop the expansion of slavery. Contain it, and eventually end it. To the South, the Republican platform was an existential threat. They did not see policy, they saw attack. The very idea that slavery could be restricted, even gradually, meant the South's entire way of life, its economy, its power, was at risk. Fear turned to fury. And with every speech from Northern Republicans, with every editorial denouncing slaveholders, the Southern narrative hardened. They no longer believed they were safe in the Union. And then came 1857, asked the dread Scott decision, a case that should have been small. One man suing for his freedom after living in free territory. But the Supreme Court turned it into something far larger and far more dangerous. Chief Justice Roger Taney ruled that Scott had no right to sue because, as a black man, he was not and could never be a U.S. citizen. But he didn't stop there. He declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, that Congress had no power to regulate slavery in the territories at all. Slavery, in effect, could spread anywhere. The reaction in the North was shock, then rage. It confirmed what many feared, that the slave power, and a term now widely used, was using every lever of federal authority to expand its reach. First the legislature, then the presidency, now the courts. And in the South the decision was celebrated. It meant they had legal cover, constitutional backing, validation from the highest court in the land, but it also meant the last tools of negotiation were crumbling. If the courts no longer protected balance, if politics no longer offered compromise, what remained? In 1858, The nation watched as two men in Illinois debated that very question. Abraham Lincoln, Stephen Douglas, 7 debates, dozens of hours, crowds gathered in open fields, climbing trees, leaning in silence. Lincoln argued that slavery must not spread, not because he sought revolution, but because he feared the nation's soul could not endure two opposing moral codes. Douglas, the architect of popular sovereignty, insisted on choice, even if that choice was slavery. But beneath the words was a sense that the ground was shifting. Lincoln did not win the Senate seat, but he won the nation's ear, and 2 years later, he would return. But before that, one more match was struck. Harper's Ferry, John Brown returned, this time with more than swords. In October 1859, he and a small band of men seized a federal armory in Virginia. His plan: incite a massive slave uprising, arm the enslaved, march through the South, burn slavery to the ground. It failed. Within hours, the town was surrounded. U.S. Marines, led by Colonel Robert E. Lee, stormed the building. Brown's sons were killed. Brown was captured, and after a swift trial he was hanged. But in death he became a martyr. To the North, he was a symbol of moral courage, of action in a time of cowardice. Emerson compared him to Christ. To the South, he was a terrorist, proof that the North no longer wanted dialogue, but destruction. Church bells rang for him in northern towns. Southern militias began drilling. It was no longer a disagreement. It was a reckoning. And then, the final collapse. The election of 1860, 4 candidates. 4 Americas: Stephen Douglas, the compromiser; John Breckinridge, the Southern firebrand; John Bell, the moderate Unionist; and Abraham Lincoln, the Republican who had once said, "I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races," but who also said that slavery was wrong and that a house divided could not stand. Lincoln won with not a single Southern electoral vote. He was not even on the ballot in 10 Southern states, and so before he could even take office, the Union began to break. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina seceded. By February, 6 more followed. Together they formed a new government, the Confederate States of America. They wrote their own constitution, chose Jefferson Davis as president, and declared that slavery, not just tolerated but protected, was their foundation. The final act was beginning. The Senate floor, once filled with debate, stood quiet. The chambers that once echoed with argument now echoed with absence. The time for words, mighty for laws, for compromise, for persuasion, had ended. The nation had run out of language, and so it would turn to fire. Chapter 4. A House Ablaze. The winter of 1860 was unusually cold, even for the Carolinas. The tobacco fields lay fallow. The small towns grew quiet at night. Yet, though the wind carried frost, something far more incendiary swept across the land. Something not of nature, but of nation. Across the South, men gathered in hushed rooms. They spoke of rights, of honor, of tradition. They spoke of fate, of courage, and of fear, because they knew their world stood under threat, and that something irreversible was happening. Secession. But this was not a protest. It was not a placer. It was a declaration of war. South Carolina had been first, bold, defiant, unwavering. On December 20, 1860, its legislature proclaimed the state had withdrawn from the Union. The words were simple. The meaning devastating. South Carolina asserted a sovereign right to govern itself, to ignore federal authority, to rise alone under its own banner. North, the reaction was stunned silence, and then outrage, calls for restraint, warnings, diplomacy. But no one asked, "Shall we negotiate?" They asked instead, "What now?" Mississippi followed, January 9th. Then Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. One by one they left the Union behind and formed the Confederate States of America. A new nation proclaiming liberty, but paradoxically, liberty built on enslavement. A nation pledging rights for its citizens while depriving others of personhood. 7 states, gone before Lincoln had even stepped into the White House. Imagine the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., a city of marble and politics. On its streets, carriage wheels rattled. Shopkeepers swept sidewalks. Fathers walked children by the Potomac. But beneath the placid day, beneath its smoke and commerce, anxiety flickered like a candle in the wind, because every moment another southern state seemed ready to break away. Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas. Lincoln knew the danger. He recognized that if more left, the Union could unravel forever. But he believed he could save it. He had made no secret of his intent, to preserve the Union at all costs. Southern leaders believed otherwise. To them, Lincoln's election was proof that the North sought to destroy their way of life, and that the Union itself was a threat. They meant to protect that life, no matter the price. And so, they built an entirely new capital, their own capital, in Montgomery, Alabama. Jefferson Davis was elected provisional president. His speech spoke of states' rights, of self-determination, of a future unmarred by Northern interference. But beneath the idealistic words lay a dark kernel: war. They needed an army. They needed guns. They needed legitimacy. Congress in Washington passed a law forbidding supply or reinforcement of federal forts under threat. They forbade federal troops from entering or even sending food to southern posts. It was a tacit acceptance, a desperate hope to avoid war. The stage was set. In Charleston Harbor sat Fort Sumter, a small granite fort guarding the harbor. It was isolated. It was federal. It was in Confederate territory. Its lone Union commander, Major Robert Anderson, had moved his soldiers from Fort Moultrie to Sumter in December, hoping for safety. Instead, he had become the spark. Weeks of negotiation followed. Telegraphed ultimatums, Lincoln's message: "We will supply only food and water, not guns or men. You may fire if you wish, but we will not provoke." The Confederacy replied, "Any supply ship approaching shall be fired upon." Both sides held their breath, neither backed down. And then it began. At 4:30, in the early pre-dawn hours of April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery around Charleston Harbor opened fire on Fort Sumter. Shells tore through the night. Explosions ripped timber. Flags were torn by wind and by war. The Union soldiers huddled inside, exhausted by bombardment. They answered, only once ineffectually, their cannon shot lobbing back into the darkness. Daylight revealed heavy damage. Walls cracked, supplies destroyed, but the fort still stood. Major Anderson, his men wounded and weary, hoisted a white flag. They surrendered the fort peacefully. No lives lost. But no matter, because there was no turning back. The first battle, if it could be called that, had begun. A single shot, fired with intention, echoed through the land and broke the fragile silence. From Maine to Missouri, word spread like wildfire. "Fort Sumter has fallen." Some cried, others clenched fists. Some whispered relief. Others raised rifles. Then Lincoln acted. He issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress rebellion, preserve the Union. He did not call for compromise. He called for war. The die was cast. Governors in northern states mobilized. Men into regiments. Town commons filled with recruits. Bands played martial airs, the Star-Spangled Banner, battle cry of freedom. Families lined train platforms, waving flags. Some cheered for unity. Some shed tears, dreading the coming darkness. The South answered in kind. Volunteers flocked to Charleston. Men kissed wives goodbye, clutched children, wrote letters home, with trembling hands promising to return and vowing not to disgrace the Confederate cause. Two nations, born of the same birth, now moved toward collision. In Richmond, Virginia, delegates gathered. They called for national defense. They authorized the seizure of federal property, all forts, arsenals, navy yards, within their territory. They prepared for war. It was not just an army they were raising. They were raising an expectation, a conviction, that their cause was righteous, that they were the true heirs of liberty, that no government could forbid them from the fruits of their land or from the ownership they claimed as property. In Washington, too, expectations hardened. Newspapers roared, "Rebels shall be chastised. Union preserved at all costs." Posters offered bounties for enlistment. The machinery of war began to hum, but amid the fervor, amid the rallies and proclamations, there were whispers, not of unity, but of devastation. The nation's first casualties would not be at Shiloh or Antietam. They would come at home. In Congress, old alliances were broken. Whigs and Democrats, Republicans and know-nothings, they dissolved. Radical voices rose. Men who had once condemned slavery now called for its abolition. Women who had once stayed silent now spoke in public. Churches divided. Congregations split. Families fractured. Communities that once welcomed travelers from both North and South now ceased to speak. Merchants refused Southern customers. Northern ministers refused to pray for Southern churches. Everything shifted. It was as if a fire had been lit, and it was spreading beyond any control. Travelers reported trains overloaded with soldiers, freight cars diverted to carry artillery. Black Americans in the North, hopeful for emancipation, found themselves enlisted in support roles: prison guard, laborer, cook. Freedmen in the South were watched closely. Slave patrols increased. Fear ran deeper than before. At West Point, cadets watched their classmates march off to opposing armies. Some had taken oaths to the Union. Others felt compelled to defend their home states. In months, these young men, once classmates, would face each other across battlefields. Brothers would fight brothers. Fathers, sons, friend against friend. No section of society would escape the blow. Yet in the middle, there were men who still believed words could end this. That diplomacy might prevail. But Jefferson Davis, now Confederate president, had no interest. He believed the North would not stand the loss of Southern ports and trade. He believed war was inevitable, and not only inevitable but necessary. In both capitals, cabinets considered plans. Congress debated finances. Governors considered state defense. Armies assembled in camp. Men drilled. They learned rank, salute, instruction. They trained in discipline. They honed their rifles. They read new manuals and memorized commands. And still, there were those who would whisper, "Can it be ended quickly?" But neither side, North nor South, had the will to step back. The die was cast. The public mood demanded victory. The national egos demanded pride. And the cause demanded blood. At Fort Sumter, last moments of the surrender unfolded slowly. As Confederate salvos ended, Anderson and his starving men lowered the flag. Scouts watched it dip, slowly, gravely. They saluted. The Confederates fired their own salute, something akin to respect in the midst of conflict. And then silence. That echo traveled up the eastern seaboard, across the Ohio Valley, through the Mississippi, to New Orleans, to San Francisco. Everywhere men felt the vibration of a nation ripping apart. When the shelling began, with motionless men in trenches, torn earth, splintered wood, something awakened in every American heart. A realization. This war would not be polite. This war would not be short. This war would burn the nation to its bones, and nothing would ever be the same. For secession was not a protest. It was a declaration. And the fires it lit would consume far more than forts. They would consume lives, cities, economies, faith, honor, humanity. This house was ablaze. And while the flames flickered, the nation held its breath. Because what was coming was not just a battle for territory. It was a battle for the soul of a nation. And somewhere, above the smoke and scrap of gunpowder and the rings of swearing men, flew the promise of America. But would that promise survive? Chapter 5. The Day the Union Died. At 4:30 on the morning of April 12, 1861, the harbor around Charleston seemed still, almost sacred, with the calm hush of dawn. The palmettos stood heavy with dew. The sky, just beginning to lighten, bore no hint of the violence to come. But the peace was brittle. It trembled beneath the heels of history. In the Confederate batteries lining Sullivan's Island, young men, barely out of boyhood, epitomized determination. Their uniforms were crisp, their eyes tense. Their hands gripped cannons that had been dragged into place days before under cover of night. These guns, Rodman, Columbiad, Dahlgren, were not just metal. They were affirmation, declaration. Manifest destiny cloaked as military purpose. At Fort Sumter, on a low island in the harbor, Major Robert Anderson stood beneath the flag. Walls of granite surrounded him, rough-hewn, solid, built to endure. Yet this fortress, this symbol of federal authority, was isolated. Supplies were scarce, morale frayed. Weeks of negotiation had worn both sides thin. Anderson had refused to surrender. The Confederates had refused to yield footing. He held the banner high, stars and stripes whipping in the pre-dawn breeze, as if to say, "We stand, we refuse." But soon, words would fail. Then came the first flash. A shell arced silently across the water. Time slowed. The cannon's report shattered the harbor's quiet. The shot screamed. Waters shimmered. Stone walls shuddered. Granite fragments scattered. A nation shuddered too. Fort Sumter answered once. A single return shot, weak, hollow, a plea rather than a strike. The cannon thudded against the fog-laced darkness and died. And then silence returned. But it was no longer the same silence. It was a silence strained with consequence. Over 400 cannon shots had been fired that first morning. Each one told a story. We will not yield. We exist. We command. In those barrages lay years of rancor, broken compromise, and seething resentment. Inside the fort, men crouched behind walls, clutching rifles. Some were veterans of earlier wars. Others, fresh recruits, shook. None knew how long this would go on. None knew what would come next. They listened to each thunderous boom. They counted the seconds. They prayed. They readied themselves for a fortress under siege, with no reinforcements, with no retreat. Charleston citizens pressed close to windows and wharfs. They watched bright flashes. They felt the vibrations under their feet. Some wept. Others cheered. Mothers clasped children. Shopkeepers closed doors. The spectacle felt like a festival of fear, electric and terrible. They had watched the shells ascend. They watched fort walls crumble. They watched smoke bloom into the sky. This was war, but the term felt almost inadequate for what was unfolding. For the first time, the Union had been fired upon, not in the halls of Congress, not in legal argument, but with steel and gunpowder. This was no act of rebellion. It was an act of war. At midday, after hours of relentless bombardment, the Confederate guns paused. The crews reloaded. The fort's men tended wounded. Anderson paced the ramparts. The flag still flew, wounded, sullied, but still aloft. The battle had not ended, but the time for words, if there ever was one, was gone. The Confederates resumed. Shells hammered the walls. Stairways collapsed. Ammunition grew low. Men were struck, some wounded, others killed. A black powder haze filled the chambers. The air tasted of iron and fear and defiance. Anderson knew the inevitability. His orders were taut. Defend. But when resistance became death, when holes yawned, in the fort's walls, when supply ships were within Confederate crosshairs, it was time to consider survival. He sent a final message. He would lower the flag. He would evacuate. He would avoid further bloodshed. The Confederate commander agreed. A truce would allow evacuation and the retrieval of wounded. No prisoners would be taken. No more blood would, today, be spilled. At dusk, a lone boat crossed the channel. It reached the damaged wharf. Anderson's men, battered but unbroken, emerged. They marched down the wharf to the boat. They watched the stars appear in the sky above them. They watched the shadows grow around them. They watched the flag come down, the stars and stripes, torn by shell fragments and stained with splatter, dripped in the evening breeze before being folded with care. Then the shots ceased. The flag was gone. Fort Sumter was Confederate. Word traveled fast, faster than steamships, faster than telegraph, even faster than rumor. The Union had lost its first fort. The Confederacy had fired the first shots. The die was cast. From Pennsylvania to Missouri, from Maine to Texas, men wept. A doctor in Albany wrote, "We have crossed the Rubicon." A banker in Cincinnati wrote, "Our nation stands at the precipice." A farmer in Iowa wrote, "The birds' songs in the morning will never feel the same." Children playing marbles paused and looked to the sky. Clergy prayed in sanctuaries. Statisticians debated casualty figures. Economists predicted ruin. Communities felt the tremor of a new world emerging beneath their feet. In Washington, the mood was grim. Lincoln paced the halls. His voice, usually calm, shook when he spoke. He sent word to governors, "Call for troops." 75,000 men, 3-year enlistments. He called it a suppression of rebellion. He believed, he hoped, that a show of overwhelming resolve would bring the Confederacy back to the table, that the Union might be restored without greater ruin. In Montgomery, Jefferson Davis hailed the victory. He spoke of righteous defense. He spoke of fulfilled prophecy. He called for volunteers to secure our independence. He placed a bounty on enemy arms and equipment. He appealed to Southern pride and Southern fear alike. This is our fight. This is our time. Meanwhile, Fort Sumter stood, quiet at last, in its damaged dignity, its ramparts scarred, its flag flying no more. It had been battered. It had surrendered. But it remained, symbolic, defiant, a monument to both the cost and the cause. That single storm of cannon fire changed everything. For the war that had always hovered now arrived in earnest. The quiet houses of congressmen would now host mustering drums and military strategists. The battle lines, once theoretical in arguments and maps, became flesh and steel. The ring of debate gave way to the blast of cannon. In towns across the north, men left plows in fields, trade in shops, hearts at the door. They boarded trains toward camps, where camaraderie, drill, disease, and destiny awaited. They believed they were going to restore the Union. They believed they would go home. In the South, husbands kissed wives, sons kissed mothers. They spoke of independence, of liberty, of vengeance. They boarded trains toward Virginia and beyond, toward the battlefield. Ladies sewed flags. Preachers prayed. Newspapers printed recruiting posters. Both sides filled their tools and tabernacles. The nation buckled beneath its own ambition. By night's end, the country had transformed. Not one drop of blood had yet been shed, but the rivers of blood that would flow were already on their way. This was not a skirmish, nor a regional outburst. This was a conflict whose theme would echo across mountains and plains, across decades of dream and dread, across every river and valley and farm. This was war. This was irrevocable. This was America reborn by fire. The day the Union died was the day America awakened, and as stars glimmered above Charleston's harbor, both sides raised glasses, sometimes through tears, to the future. A future built on hope or on horror. A future where freedom would be forged or fractured forever. The first chapter of the Civil War had been written in fire and fury, and the chapters to come would be written on fields of blood. Chapter 6. The Picnic That Ended in Panic. The morning light of July 21, 1861, broke gently over northern Virginia. Dew-laden grass glistened, birds flitted through the trees. The air felt almost festive, soft, warm, unsuspecting. Families arrived. At Bull Run Creek near the Manassas Junction, armed not for war but for a day out. Wicker baskets brimming with fried chicken, lemon cakes, fresh berries. Children clutching new hats and parasols. A leisurely carriage ride had delivered them to what they believed would be a spectacle, maybe even a patriotic celebration. Soldiers, too, mingled with the crowd. Boys in crisp uniforms, muskets slung. Casually, smiles unburdened by memory. Some brought drummers carrying their drums to perform martial tunes, the Star-Spangled Banner, the battle cry of freedom. Wounded veterans, convalescent from earlier skirmishes, walked with canes, eager to witness what they were told would be a glorious confrontation. Coaches idled in the distance. Servants laid out linens on gentle slopes. Mothers fanned themselves, chatting. Fathers pinched cheeks, watching. It seemed like a pageant, like a picnic with purpose. And then, at dawn, the first gunshot, sharp, detached, cracked through the serenity. Muskets volleyed on distant ridges. Cannon fire followed, full, sudden, rattling. Smoke rolled over fields once green. Muskets erupted with the speed of rattlesnakes. Plumes of grey enveloped the landscape. Panic rose like a tide. Crowds gasped. Feet scattered. Children clung to mothers. Baskets tumbled. A teaspoon fell into a crate of berries with a dull clink. Nobody noticed. Only the roar of rifles. In the field, lines clashed, Union blue against Confederate grey. Men barely past boyhood fired into one another, clear-eyed, determined, or terrified. Horses bolted. A carriage overturned. The driver was thrown. A woman screamed. Soldiers formed ranks. A cannonball buried itself in earth a few yards from a group of lovers, sitting cross-legged, unaware until the blast. Laughter died. Silence broke. A child's cry rose, piercing. Bullets widened by panic ricocheted. A shell erupted in midfield, ripping sod, tearing limbs, sending screams across the creek. Spectators froze. Some looked away. Some fainted. Mothers held children until tears blurred their vision. Fathers paled, hands tight around crepe ribbons on sunbonnets. A young Union sergeant, his uniform new, lay wounded, entangled in grasses. He called for water. His voice cracked. A Confederate volunteer stumbled to his side, hushed, careful. He lifted a canteen. "Drink," he said. That word echoed. Two enemies, bound by blood and mercy. Smoke thickened. Wounds stained grass red-brown. Drums drowned out sobs. Officers barked orders, futile. Ranks broke and reformed. Chaos became choreography of fear. Stonewall Jackson, arriving on scene, became legend. Standing like rock, he pulled writhing men to safety, rallying lines broken by panic. His calm defiance steeled the grey tide. Cheers rose and then rocked to grief as waves of blue surged back. By midday, reinforcements tipped the balance. Confederate units, fresh and resolute, pushed Union troops into retreat. Union regiments collapsed into the woods. Muskets were left behind, flags caught in briars, drums abandoned. Families, some still clutching baskets, fled with the army, running, stumbling, shouting. Women helped children over fences. Men shepherded wives through fields of wounded men. Spectators, their leisurely hats skewed, now stained and torn, found refuge behind wagons. Berkeley family who brought a picnic arrived home to find broken glass, spilled soup, and a memory. They would never forget the echo of dying men. The retreat turned into rout. Union artillery crews limped away, abandoning guns. Retreating soldiers smashed wagons. Horses balked. Men stumbled into Bull Run Creek, crossing waist-deep, bullets whizzing overhead. Some drowned in panic. Many more were carried by comrades. Fatal. To hold or flee, when the field fell silent, the dead lay still. Union blues intertwined with Confederate greys. The soil beneath them dark red. Mosquitoes droned above. Grass flattened. Uniforms stained. Rifles and rattling bayonets littered the earth. As sun dipped toward horizon, survivors walked the ground. They carried wounded, collected weapons, covered faces in grief. One Confederate medic, kneeling, found a Union drummer boy, no older than 13. He covered him with a grey blanket. The boy's eyes flickered, war's innocence stolen. In small towns around the battlefield, townspeople heard distant bursting shells. They trembled, asking when it was our turn. When would this carnage arrive in our fields, in our homes and the soldiers? They looked at one another, pistols drawn by their sides. Some hugged, some wept, some stamped the dust from boots. A Union lieutenant with face smudged by gunpowder stopped a fleeing private in the woods. "Remember this day," he said softly. "Remember what this war is." The private nodded, swallowing. That war, so far abstract, had claimed flesh, souls, futures. When night fell, the wounded were loaded on trains headed home. Blood seeped into straw. Moans filled boxcars. Townspeople provided quilts. Ministers met trains with prayers. Wind carried the clang of hammers, building hearses. Churches prepared for funerals. The next morning, newspapers proclaimed, "Disaster near Manassas. The Union defeated. Stonewall holds." Many spoke of heroism, many spoke of shame. Some families buried sons on their own land. Others sent bodies home for embalming, memorial services. Fathers weeping at empty chairs. Bull Run was more than a battle. It was a reckoning, not of strategy but of reality, of innocence lost, of war's price. It exposed the lie that this war would be short, that tradition, romance, flags alone would hold men in sacrifice, that American sons would march, then return to comfortable homes. No, now they would march into disease, siege, horror, attrition, no longer a war declared in newspapers or debated in Congress, but a war lived in bloody trenches, in trench-rife fever, in shattered towns, in seared memories. Bull Run became a lesson. It taught. This war was not a picnic. This war was real. It was also a mirror. It reflected the raw truth. Neighbor could kill neighbor. Brother would fight brother. Citizen would watch in terror. Degrees of guilt shifted but not absolved. Crowds confessed. We thought show. But reality had thundered. We did not know terror. A minister standing beside a mass grave prayed, "God have mercy on our divided land." Birds remained silent. The air tasted of iron. Smoke lingered. Spades struck soil. Men felled trees for coffins. The day faded. Survivors lit lanterns. The wounded groaned. Sleep came uncertainly. Dreams were haunted. Infant cries echoed the battlefields. Moan, for many, Bull Run was where childhood died, where belief in quick victory evaporated, where the nation, still one, on paper, became two. The line between Union and Confederacy was no longer imaginary. It was drawn in blood, and every American, north or south, carried that line, etched forever in memory. Chapter 7. Shadows over Shiloh. The dawn of April 6, 1862, broke over southwestern Tennessee with deceptive calm. Mist shrouded the gently rolling fields around Pittsburg Landing, masses of damp air clinging to trees, hiding their outlines. The Tennessee River, wide and slow, reflected pale sunlight in tremulous ripples, yet held an uneasy stillness. Faithful citizens believed this would be another quiet spring day. Farmers on leave believed they'd return to home hearths by nightfall. Congregations expected greetings at Sunday services, at church doors, but those hopes were misplaced. At Pittsburg Landing, Major General Ulysses S. Grant's Army of the Tennessee was encamped. Nearly 40,000 men, diluted by disease and fatigue, dysentery, measles, exhaustion. They'd come upriver chasing victory. They believed they faced a weary enemy in Shiloh Church and across wild peanut fields to the west. They thought they had time to rest. They were wrong. For General Albert Sidney Johnston and General P.G.T. Beauregard, Confederate commanders in the west, time was peril. Their Army of Mississippi, ready but anxious, numbering nearly 44,000, waited, steeling for an attack. They hoped to surprise Grant's men before they could entrench, before they could be joined by reinforcements. Theirs would be a swift, brutal morning blow. And if dawn had seemed peaceful, that peace was only the hush before thunder. The mist thinned. First light crept into pewter fields. And at 5:30, the first shots shattered the quiet. A sharp echo. A rifle's crack. A burst of artillery. Souls jerked awake. Men bolted upright from makeshift tents. Some staggered. Some tried to load rifles with shaking fingers. Some lay still, slaughtered before they knew there was danger. From Shiloh Church, Confederates advanced, columns emerging like ghosts, gray silhouettes slipping through blowing smoke and snaking toward Union camps. Confederate regiments had brought coffee cups to their lips before the order came. Now they marched, faces grave, bayonets fixed, eagerness hidden behind discipline. On they moved, through coffee stands and latrine pits, straight into stunned camps. Sleep turned to horror. Drills became desperate fights for survival. That first morning was chaos writ large. Union forces hurried into lines. Blue-hued regiments tried to hold creaking fences. They peered across wood lines, glimpsing gray caps, enemy, but could not yet grasp the scope of attack. Federal artillery crews wrestled with flintlocks and spark. Orders shouted over concussion, tangled into confusion. In one grove of trees, a rifle volley ripped across the woods. A colonel, Major Henry Stark of the 15th Iowa, was struck dead mid-command. His body slumped. Soldiers tumbled behind him. They froze, then fired back. A nurse pulled from the ranks by instinct. Later, she would say, "I saw calm descend except for the smoke." Smoke, it set the tone. It drifted over fields. It choked lungs. It obscured lines. It became a wall between friend and foe. Ministers carried Bibles into the haze. Musicians played lullabies to soothe the men. Some prayed, some cursed. Some simply stared into nothing, too stunned to feel. For the Confederates, attack was thunderous. They pressed, line by line. They yelled. They raised flags. They crashed through woodland. Morning. But Grant's men rallied by brush, by trench, by broken plow. They raised small defenses, desperate pockets of resistance. Not far to the rear, near the landing, the hospital tents filled fast. Wounded men poured from lines, some wounded in retreat, some wounded while kneeling in prayer, some wounded while fighting. A captain carried a private's head in his arms and rescued him from floodwaters as shells whined overhead. In those hours, pain became vivid. Screams carried on wind. Blood sat like oil beneath men's boots. A medley of musket smoke and cannon smoke filled nostrils. And still, soldiers held their lines. Grant, receiving staggered updates from aides, refused to retreat. "Hold until the boys come up," he wired Washington. He meant the Army of the Ohio, commanded by Don Carlos Buell, thousands more preparing upriver. But until they arrived, Grant would stay. Elsewhere, Confederate General Johnston paced behind embattled lines, sword drawn. At one point he strode past supply wagons, unbothered as shell casings bounced around his boots. He stopped. He watched the blue lines break. He smiled with grim resolve. Then, a bullet found him. A single shot to the leg artery. He fell. He was carried off by aides, his leg pressed firm by surgeon's hand. He died not long after, bleeding into the red mud. When news reached the regiments, grief fell in waves. Johnston's death was more than the loss of a leader. It was a signal. Victory might yet slip away. Confederates faltered. They retraced. Lines, their attack wavered. The gray tide lost its sheen. That afternoon, as the sun climbed, Union lines reformed. Fresh regiments joined. Soldiers, terrified yet galvanized, started pushing back. They paused only to collect the dead. They paused only to gather their resolve. By evening, Grant's men held their positions, not with triumph, but with survival. They dug trenches. They huddled behind trees. They listened for Buell's reinforcements. They lamented casualties, dead valued at nearly 10,000 by the end of day one. The wounded, 5,000 more, lay moaning under covers of torn blankets. The river mirrored evening's muted pink. It carried hushed ambulances. It held out hope. Buell's division steamed downstream. Grant knew the tide had turned, only because those blue-clad reinforcements were coming. Night enveloped the field. Fires burned in the dark. Cannon fires, lanterns, campfires. Ghostly shapes moved among bodies, confusing the enemy. Bravery mingled with terror. The wounded lay close. They spoke softly to each other. They asked whose cause this had served. They asked if God would still hear them. A surgeon dressed a corporal's thigh wound, a chaplain read psalms. Horses, stunned, bleated, dogs whimpered. Sleep came in fits, then came dawn. April 7th, the second day, began with a haze deeper than the first day, but with sound differently charged. Morning gunfire shook trenches. Union men, fed and reinforced, advanced like slow-moving tide. They battered Confederate lines. They drove them past Shiloh Church, past peach orchards, past creek crossings. Confederates, exhausted, leaderless, fell back. They formed small fighting rings. They waited near logs. They heard General Beauregard's order, retreat. By mid-morning, with steady pressure, Union regiments moved forward in waves of pressure. At one creek crossing, a Confederate unit pinned, prepared to make their stand. Their captain signaled a charge. They fired. They charged, even though their casualties soared. Midway across the smoke-choked field, few remained. Yet, their sacrifice allowed others to escape. Many died within feet of their retreating comrades. All. Dow's Union counterattack pressed. Grant's men acted with reluctant vengeance. They flanked entrenched gray. They seized gun emplacements. They buried the dead. When the smoke cleared, midday sent translucent rays onto a changed field. Gone were banners of gray, banners of blue lifted high. By afternoon, Beauregard ordered full retreat. Confederates withdrew toward Corinth, Mississippi, the wounded, the broken, the weary. And, taken hostage by their own casualties, 8,000 more than Grant's forces, on both sides, and more than 23,000 casualties. But what did victory mean? For Grant, he had survived annihilation. He had defied convention, orders, and critics. He would not resign. He would not run. He would carry his fame from Shiloh upward. For Beauregard, the assault had failed. He had watched 10,000 of his men fall in hours. He had witnessed his leader die from a single bullet. He would retreat under reluctant respect for Grant's mettle, for soldiers on both sides. Shiloh became baptism. Baptism by blood, by suffering. Skeletons of bunkers, corpses of friends and enemies. The war was not romantic. It was a furnace of hell. No more drills, no more flags, no more ceremony. There was only survival, only missing limbs, only nightmares. That night, fields were silent, but for the wind. The wounded, swelling, would die overnight. Those spared would remember. Many wrote letters home. "The damnedest sights I ever saw," wrote a private. "I've never prayed so hard in my life," wrote a young nurse. Native Americans who followed regiments to forage watched in disbelief. "I thought war was words," one later recalled. But there was no words there, only the cries of men. Civilians in nearby towns awoke to deserted homes, occupied by the wounded. They saw the dead laid against fences. They felt the air's rancid tang. They wondered whether to flee. Shiloh would mark history. It would force politicians to understand that this war would demand more than volunteers, more than prayer. It would demand factories, railroads, logistics, heavy artillery, medicine, profound planning. In Washington, Lincoln read Shiloh dispatches and sighed. The cost was terrible, yet the North could survive. The South had lost momentum and its greatest general. Shiloh stripped innocence. It reduced slogans to ash. It revealed that words, like honor, glory, nobility, were no shields. It showed death's flavor, pain's weight, and fear's depth. It exposed that soldiers might survive speech, but not bullets. Privates carried lice, lieutenants carried guilt, generals carried burden. The land carried blood. The contractors carried cost. The mothers carried absence of sons, of breadwinners. Dwellings would be quiet for generations. Shiloh's fields would hold bodies for months. Families would receive letters asking, did he survive? Did he die well? Shiloh raised questions, not answers. Questions like, how many deaths is a city worth? How many villages? How much political unity? Passengers reading newspapers on streetcars stared into distance, touched cold medals, or ran children's fingers down clean collars, questioning, what have we done? Shiloh's echoes would last longer than the guns. The war had changed, Permanently, it had taken innocence. It had left shadows. Chapter 8. The General. No one knew. In the vast unfolding drama of the American Civil War, names like Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Jefferson Davis resonate with a clarity born of legend. Yet, there was another name, initially whispered only in military circles, barely known beyond the muddy fields and makeshift camps of the Western Theater, Ulysses S. Grant, a man whose ascent from obscurity would become one of the most remarkable stories of leadership and resilience in the nation's darkest hour. This is the story of the general no one knew. Born in the small town of Point Pleasant, Ohio in 1822, Grant's early life was marked by ordinary beginnings and quiet ambition. The son of a tanner and leather worker, he grew up in a modest household, far removed from the polished halls of power that would later shape the course of history. He attended West Point, graduating in 1843, but it was his service in the Mexican-American War that first showed glimpses of his military promise. Yet after that conflict, life took a difficult turn. Grant struggled to find his footing in civilian life. He faced bouts of failure and battled personal demons, including a period of heavy drinking that nearly cost him his career. When war broke out in 1861, few could have predicted that this man, then working at a remote payroll office in Illinois, would soon rise to lead armies. His return to military service was met with skepticism by many. Some viewed him as a troubled officer whose best days were behind him. But Grant's quiet determination, his refusal to be defined by past failures, propelled him forward. He quickly earned a reputation for grit and an uncanny ability to seize the moment. Grant's first notable success came in February 1862, at Fort Donelson, Tennessee. Here he earned the nickname that would follow him, Unconditional Surrender Grant. When Confederate commanders offered terms, Grant demanded nothing less than total capitulation. His stern resolve stunned friend and foe alike. The victory opened the Cumberland River to Union forces, striking a blow to the Confederate western defenses and electrifying the Northern cause. It was a brutal, bloody battle, but it revealed a leader who understood that war demanded unwavering resolve. But Grant's path to greatness was far from smooth. The battles that followed would test not only his strategic mind, but his capacity to endure hardship and loss. In April 1862, at the Battle of Shiloh, his forces were caught off guard by a ferocious Confederate assault. The fighting was savage, the casualties staggering. Over 23,000 men killed, wounded, or missing in just 2 days. Many questioned Grant's leadership after the near disaster. Yet his steadfast refusal to retreat, his ability to hold the line until reinforcements arrived, marked a turning point. Shiloh was a baptism by fire, a brutal introduction to the grim realities of the conflict. It showed a man who, despite setbacks, refused to give in. As the war dragged on, Grant's approach grew more deliberate and comprehensive. Unlike some generals who sought glory in single, decisive engagements, Grant understood that victory would come through sustained pressure, a war of attrition aimed at exhausting the Confederacy's resources and will to fight. His campaigns became relentless, moving deeper into Confederate territory with unwavering purpose. One of his most masterful operations was the Siege of Vicksburg in 1863. This fortress city, perched on the Mississippi River, was a strategic linchpin. Its capture would split the Confederacy and give the Union control of the vital river artery. Grant's siege was methodical and unforgiving. For 6 weeks, his troops encircled the city, cutting off supplies and bombarding it relentlessly. Starvation and disease ravaged the defenders. On July 4, 1863, the Confederate garrison surrendered. The victory at Vicksburg, coupled with the Union triumph at Gettysburg, marked a crucial turning point in the war. Grant's successes, however, brought him both acclaim and controversy. His critics accused him of recklessness, charging headlong into battles that cost thousands of lives. His blunt demeanor and refusal to engage in the political machinations of Washington made him a figure of suspicion and resentment among some elites. Yet President Abraham Lincoln saw in Grant a different kind of leader, one who understood the brutal necessities of war, who was willing to make the hard decisions that others avoided. In 1864, Lincoln appointed Grant as General-in-Chief of all Union armies. This was a momentous decision, signaling a shift in Union strategy. Grant's vision was clear: simultaneous offensives across multiple fronts to stretch Confederate forces thin, to deny them any chance of regrouping or resupplying. His campaigns became a symphony of coordinated assaults, from the Wilderness to Cold Harbor, from Petersburg to Atlanta. Grant pressed Lee's forces with relentless intensity, accepting staggering casualties as the terrible price of ultimate victory. Grant's leadership style was marked by a combination of calm resolve and fierce determination. Unlike generals, who might have been daunted by the scale of the conflict or the cost in human lives, Grant faced the reality head-on. He shared the hardships of his men, riding the lines, visiting the wounded, maintaining a steady presence even amid chaos. His personal letters reveal a man deeply burdened by the weight of command, haunted by the suffering around him, yet steeled by his commitment to preserve the Union. As 1865 dawned, the Confederacy was crumbling. Grant's forces tightened, the noose around Richmond and Petersburg. The final months of the war were marked by grueling sieges and desperate last stands. On April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, Grant met with Robert E. Lee. The surrender marked the beginning of the end, a moment of profound significance, where one man's rise from obscurity met another's fall from command. Ulysses S. Grant, the general no one knew, had become the general who saved the Union. His journey was not a tale of sudden glory, but one of persistent struggle, of a man who bore the burdens of war with unyielding resolve. In the ashes of a fractured nation, Grant emerged as a symbol of endurance and tenacity, a testament to the idea that greatness is forged through resilience, courage, and an unshakable belief in a cause greater than oneself. This chapter in history reminds us that leadership is often quiet at first, unnoticed, underestimated, until it meets the moment that demands it most. Grant's rise was not accidental. It was the product of experience, hardship, and a steadfast heart. His legacy would not only shape the outcome of the Civil War, but also redefine what it meant to lead in America's most turbulent hour. The general no one knew became, in time, the general the nation could never forget. Chapter 9. Steel Ships and Iron Wills. The American Civil War was a conflict that reshaped the very fabric of a nation, but it was also a war that ushered in a new era of technological innovation, forever changing the nature of warfare itself. One of the most dramatic and transformative chapters in this story unfolded beneath the waves, where steel ships and iron wills clashed in a battle that would echo across history. This is the story of the day war went underwater and changed forever. For centuries, naval warfare had relied on wooden ships, majestic vessels powered by sails and cannon fire, their hulls vulnerable to the relentless pounding of enemy broadsides. But the mid-19th century was a time of invention and revolution. Steam engines had begun to replace the wind. Iron and steel were starting to take the place of wood. The American Civil War became a testing ground for these advancements, a place where old traditions met new realities, with consequences that would ripple across the world. The key players in this underwater drama were two ships, the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia. Their clash at Hampton Roads, Virginia in March 1862 was the first meeting of ironclad warships in combat, a battle that would forever change naval strategy and technology. The CSS Virginia was born from desperation and ingenuity. After the Union captured the Norfolk Navy Yard, the Confederacy salvaged the burned-out hulk of the USS Merrimac, a wooden steam frigate. They rebuilt it, plating its sides with thick iron armor, turning it into a formidable ironclad warship. Renamed the CSS Virginia, it boasted heavy guns and the ability to withstand enemy fire that would have destroyed any traditional wooden ship. On the other side, the Union scrambled to counter this new threat. Enter the USS Monitor, a strange and innovative vessel designed by the Swedish-American engineer John Ericsson. Unlike traditional ships, the Monitor had a low, flat deck, a rotating turret that housed 2 large cannons, and thick iron armor covering its entire structure. It was unlike anything the world had ever seen, a floating fortress of steel and ingenuity. The Anticipation built as the 2 ironclads faced each other on March 9, 1862, in the waters off Hampton Roads. The battle that followed was tense, grinding, and unprecedented. Cannonballs that would have shattered wooden hulls bounced harmlessly off the iron plating. The CSS Virginia rammed the USS Congress and USS Cumberland, sinking them with brutal efficiency. But when it engaged the Monitor, the fight entered new territory. For hours, the 2 ironclads circled, firing their cannons, their shots thudding against the armored sides without decisive damage. The Monitor's revolving turret allowed it to target the Virginia's vulnerable points, while the Virginia's powerful rams and heavy guns tested the Monitor's resilience. Neither ship could claim a clear victory that day, but the battle sent shockwaves through naval powers worldwide. This clash marked the end of the age of wooden warships and the dawn of a new era, one defined by iron and steel, steam and turrets, innovation and adaptation. Navies everywhere took notice, scrambling to design and build their own ironclads, knowing the face of warfare had changed irrevocably. But the impact of the ironclads went beyond technology. Their battle symbolized the broader struggle of the Civil War, a clash not just of armies and ideologies, but of old worlds and new possibilities. The ironclads embodied the industrial might and ingenuity that would come to define the conflict. They also revealed the increasing importance of control over rivers, ports and coastlines, vital arteries that would shape the war's outcome. The war on the water was brutal and unforgiving. Ironclads patrolled the Mississippi River, the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic coast, enforcing blockades, supporting land campaigns and challenging Confederate defenses. The Union's Anaconda Plan, designed to squeeze the Confederacy by controlling its waterways, depended heavily on these powerful vessels. At the same time, innovations in naval warfare extended to submarines and torpedoes, primitive by today's standards, but groundbreaking at the time. The Confederate submarine H.L. Hunley, for example, became the first successful combat submarine in history when it sank the USS Housatonic in 1864. Though the Hunley was lost shortly after, its mission demonstrated the growing complexity of naval technology. The stories of the sailors and engineers who built and operated these vessels are tales of courage and determination. Life aboard an ironclad was perilous, confined spaces, the threat of explosions, and the ever-present danger of battle created a harsh existence. Yet those who served showed remarkable resilience, their iron wills matching the steel that surrounded them. The war's underwater battles also revealed the human cost behind technological progress. Many sailors died from injuries, disease, or suffocation in the cramped hulls. The intense noise, heat, and smoke tested their endurance. Still, their sacrifices paved the way for the modern Navy, shaping tactics and engineering for generations to come. As the Civil War progressed, the dominance of ironclads grew. The Union's naval superiority tightened the blockade around the Confederacy, choking off supplies and crippling the Southern war effort. Control of the Mississippi River was secured through a series of ironclad-led assaults, splitting the Confederacy in two and sealing its fate. By the war's end, the era of wooden sailing ships was over. Steel and steam had taken command of the seas, and the lessons learned from those first clashes beneath the waves would echo into the 20th century and beyond. The Battle of Hampton Roads, with its steel ships and iron wills, was more than a historic naval engagement. It was a turning point in the story of war itself. It demonstrated how innovation could shift the balance of power, how courage in the face of uncertainty could redefine what was possible. In the grand narrative of the American Civil War, where battles were fought on fields of cotton, corn, and blood-soaked earth, the war beneath the waves carved its own indelible mark. It reminded a fractured nation, and the world, that progress waits for no one and that even in the darkest hours of conflict, the relentless march of invention and human spirit could forge a new future. This chapter closes with the echo of cannon fire on iron hulls, the hiss of steam engines, and the steadfast resolve of men who dared to venture into uncharted waters. The day war went underwater and changed forever remains a testament to the power of innovation and the enduring will to survive and prevail. Chapter 10. A War of Brothers. The American Civil War was unlike any conflict before or since, because it was a war fought not just between armies or ideologies, but within families, within communities, within hearts. It was a war that cleaved homes in two, where brothers found themselves on opposite sides of a deadly divide. Sons faced sons, fathers faced sons, neighbors became enemies, and blood stained the very soil that once united them. From the first rumblings of secession to the final shots fired at Appomattox, the war tore at the social fabric of the United States. This was not a distant foreign war fought by strangers across oceans. It was a domestic, intimate tragedy, one that left scars far deeper than the wounds of battle. To understand the true cost of this conflict, we must look beyond grand strategies and famous generals. We must look into the homes where families were shattered, friendships severed, and lives forever altered. In towns and farms across the divided nation, the Civil War was a deeply personal affair. Families who had lived side by side for generations suddenly found themselves divided by the sharp lines of allegiance. The decisions were wrenching. To whom did a son's loyalty belong? To the Union, the country of his birth, or to the Confederacy, the state and way of life he held dear? For many there was no middle ground. Love and duty became entwined with grief and regret. Take, for example, the story of the Crittenden family from Kentucky. John Jordan Crittenden, a respected senator and statesman, sought desperately to preserve the Union through compromise. Yet his own sons chose opposing sides, one fighting for the North, the other for the South. Their family dinners became quiet, strained affairs, each man bearing the heavy burden of divided loyalty. Stories like theirs were repeated countless times in every corner of the war-torn land. The border states, Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and others, became battlegrounds not just of armies but of families. Here, neighbors could be found on opposite sides of picket lines, and in many cases brothers marched against brothers in the fields of battle. The personal anguish of these divides was compounded by the brutal nature of Civil War combat, where hand-to-hand fighting, sharpshooters, and close-range artillery fire meant the enemy was often frighteningly close. In some families, the conflict even pitted fathers against sons. The story of the Wilson family in Tennessee is one such haunting example. The patriarch, a staunch Confederate sympathizer, saw his eldest son enlist in the Confederate Army with pride. But his younger son, convinced of the Union cause, joined the Northern forces. The war's cruel hand forced these men, bound by blood, into mortal opposition. Letters sent home were fraught with sorrow, guilt, and unspoken hopes for reconciliation that would never come. But this war was not simply a matter of blood relations split by ideology. It was a clash of cultures, economies, and visions for the future. Families in the South often viewed the conflict as a desperate fight to preserve their way of life, rooted in agriculture, states' rights, and, crucially, slavery. Northern families, meanwhile, largely supported a vision of a united nation, one increasingly industrialized, abolitionist, and expanding westward. These differences fed the fires of division, turning homes into battlefields of conflicting loyalties. The experiences of soldiers themselves reflect this fractured reality. Many enlisted not out of hatred for the other side, but out of a sense of duty, to family, to community, to the idea of honor. Letters from the front reveal the anguish of men caught between love for their kin and loyalty to their cause. They spoke of longing for home, of the pain of leaving behind wives, children, and parents, and of the bitter knowledge that their brothers might be standing on the opposite side of a shooting line. One poignant letter from a Union soldier named Thomas to his brother James, fighting for the Confederacy, captures the heartache. Though we wear different colors, we bleed the same blood. May God grant us both the courage to survive this terrible ordeal and the hope that one day our family may be whole again. Letters like these, smuggled through battle lines or carried home by weary messengers, became lifelines of connection. Amid chaos, the war's brutality shattered many families beyond repair. Casualty lists, numbering hundreds of thousands dead, wounded, or missing, carried the names of brothers, cousins, fathers, and sons. In some cases, entire families were wiped out, leaving widows, orphans, and communities to pick up the pieces. The psychological toll on survivors, both soldiers and civilians, was immense, with trauma, grief, and loss casting long shadows over the nation's future. Beyond the immediate families, whole communities felt the rupture. Towns were split, with neighbors spying on neighbors, sometimes turning violent. The loyalty of clergy, merchants, farmers, and politicians was tested. Some churches and schools divided along sectional lines, leaving congregations fractured. Even after the fighting ended, the wounds of these divisions ran deep, complicating reconstruction and the long road toward healing. Yet amid the devastation, there were moments of humanity and reconciliation. Soldiers on opposing sides, sometimes, exchanged gifts or shared brief truces on the battlefield. Families, despite separation, found ways to communicate, comfort, and hold on to hope. Stories of reunion after the war, of brothers and fathers coming together again, remind us that even in the darkest times, the bonds of family and love endured. The American Civil War's title as A War of Brothers is more than metaphor. It is the truth etched in every torn letter, every shattered home, every grieving mother's lament. It is the story of a nation divided not just by politics or geography, but by the most intimate of bonds. The cost of this internal conflict cannot be measured solely by battle deaths or political outcomes, but by the fracturing of the very relationships that hold a society together. As the war marched on and the battles grew fiercer, the sacrifices of these families grew heavier. Sons marched off to fight, some never to return. Letters stopped coming, leaving aching uncertainty behind. The war's end would bring reunification, but at a cost measured in broken hearts, lost generations, and a legacy of pain that would take decades to heal. This chapter in the Civil War's story reminds us that war is not an abstract clash of armies. It is a human tragedy, lived and felt in the bonds of family, tested by loyalty and marked by the price of divided hearts. In understanding this, we come closer to grasping the true magnitude of the American Civil War, its suffering, its complexity, and its enduring impact on the soul of a nation. Chapter 11. The Blood Price of Politics. On September 17, 1862, the fields and woods near Sharpsburg, Maryland, became the stage for a battle unlike any other in American history. The Battle of Antietam, known also as the Battle of Sharpsburg, would come to be remembered as the single bloodiest day in the nation's story. In just 12 relentless hours, over 23,000 men would fall wounded, dead, or missing. The cost, staggering and almost unimaginable, was paid not only in blood but in the hopes and fears of a divided country. But Antietam was more than just a day of carnage. It was a collision of political will, military ambition, and the raw human cost of a nation at war with itself. It was a moment when the fragile threads holding the Union together were stretched to the breaking point, and, in the aftermath, a turning point emerged, altering the course of the Civil War forever. The battle began in the early morning, as Union forces under Major General George B. McClellan moved to confront the invading Confederate Army commanded by General Robert E. Lee. Lee, emboldened by recent victories in Virginia, had taken the bold step of carrying the war onto northern soil. His hope was to rally support among Marylanders, sway foreign powers to recognize the Confederacy, and relieve pressure on Virginia's farms and towns. This was not just a military campaign, it was a gamble on the political stage. Yet as dawn broke, the fields near Antietam Creek became a crucible of violence and uncertainty. The landscape, rolling hills, cornfields, stone walls, and dense woods, turned into a deadly maze where tens of thousands clashed in brutal close-quarters combat. The soldiers fought with a ferocity born of conviction and desperation, each man knowing that this battle could decide the fate of their nation. The morning saw the fierce struggle at the cornfield, where Union and Confederate troops surged forward and back, the ground soaked with blood and torn by cannon fire. The thunder of muskets and artillery echoed through the haze of smoke, creating a deafening symphony of war. Men fell by the thousands, some dying instantly, others writhing in pain amidst cries for help. The human toll was staggering, and yet the battle pressed on. To the west, the sunken road, later grimly dubbed Bloody Lane, became a killing ground. Confederate soldiers took up a defensive position along the natural trench, inflicting heavy casualties on advancing Union troops. The fighting here was some of the war's most intense and desperate. The narrow corridor turned into a gauntlet of death, where every inch of ground was contested with brutal determination. Bodies piled up, and the scene became a haunting testament to the horrific price of conflict. As the afternoon wore on, Union forces launched a desperate assault on the Confederate right flank, targeting a stone bridge later known as Burnside's Bridge. Despite repeated attacks, the Union troops faced fierce resistance from a small contingent of Confederate defenders, who held their ground against overwhelming numbers for hours. The battle for this bridge became emblematic of the entire conflict, a grueling test of endurance, strategy, and willpower. Throughout the day, commanders on both sides wrestled with the fog of war, uncertain intelligence, delayed reinforcements, and split-second decisions that would mean life or death for thousands. McClellan, criticized for his cautious approach, failed to press the full advantage against a retreating Lee, allowing the Confederate Army to withdraw back across the Potomac River. When the fighting finally ceased, the fields around Antietam were littered with the dead and dying. The air hung heavy with smoke, mingled with the cries of the wounded and the quiet final breaths of the fallen. Families across the nation received the grim news. Sons, brothers, fathers lost in a battle that seemed both distant and painfully immediate. Yet amidst this devastation, the battle had significant political consequences. President Abraham Lincoln had been waiting for a Union victory, a sign that the tide of the war might be turning. The bloodshed at Antietam, while costly, gave him the opportunity he sought to issue a proclamation that would reshape the meaning and stakes of the conflict. Just 5 days after the battle, on September 22, 1862, Lincoln announced the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This historic decree declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory would be set free as of January 1, 1863. It transformed the war from a fight to preserve the Union into a battle for human freedom, adding a moral imperative to the Union cause and preventing European powers, like Britain and France, from recognizing or supporting the Confederacy. The Emancipation Proclamation also had profound effects on the battlefield. It allowed for the enlistment of black soldiers in the Union Army, giving the North fresh manpower and further undermining the Southern economy and social order. The war, already a crucible of suffering, became a struggle for the very soul of the nation. Yet the price paid for this political and moral shift was almost unbearable. The men who fought at Antietam endured unimaginable horror. Sunken roads turned to slaughterhouses, fields soaked with blood, and comrades falling all around. Stories emerged of soldiers trying to aid their wounded friends amid the chaos, of medics overwhelmed and hospitals overflowing. The suffering was vast and often invisible to those far from the front. The battle also highlighted the brutal reality of 19th-century warfare. Rifled muskets and artillery had increased lethality, but medical knowledge and practices had not kept pace. Wounded men faced infection, amputation, and long, painful recoveries. The cries from makeshift field hospitals lingered long after the guns fell silent. For the soldiers on both sides, the experience of Antietam left deep scars, physical and emotional. Letters home told of horror and exhaustion, of the thin line between courage and fear. Some wrote of their hope that the sacrifices might bring peace. Others grappled with the meaning of such loss. The battlefield became a place where ideals and reality collided, where the cost of politics was paid in blood. As historians look back on Antietam, they see more than a battle. They see a defining moment when the brutal reality of civil war forced a nation to confront its deepest contradictions. The price was staggering, over 3,600 dead and more than twice that number wounded. But the consequences would echo far beyond the bloodied fields. The battle's aftermath rippled through the corridors of power, the homes of common folk and the hearts of men and women on both sides. It was a stark reminder that the decisions of leaders carried consequences far beyond politics and strategy. Each command given, each bullet fired, was a choice with a human face. Antietam stands today not only as a memorial to those who gave their lives, but as a testament to the profound costs of division and the complex interplay between war and politics. It challenges us to remember that behind every statistic lies a story of sacrifice, pain, hope, and the relentless pursuit of a nation's ideals amid its darkest hours. The blood price of politics was paid in full that day on those fields of Maryland, and the nation would never be the same. Chapter 12. A pen mightier than the sword on. A crisp autumn day in 1862, the American Civil War reached a moment that would forever alter the course of the nation, a moment where the power of a single pen stroke eclipsed the roar of cannons and the thunder of muskets. It was the day President Abraham Lincoln unveiled the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, a bold gamble that transformed the very meaning of the war. The war until then had been framed primarily as a desperate struggle to preserve the Union, a contest between states and sovereignty, between North and South. But with this proclamation, Lincoln cast the conflict in a new light. It became unequivocally a fight for human freedom. The path to that moment was neither straightforward nor assured. Lincoln had wrestled with the issue of slavery since before the first shot at Fort Sumter. The institution was deeply entrenched in the Southern economy and culture, and its abolition was both a moral imperative and a political minefield. Lincoln, cautious by nature and aware of the fragile unity within the Union, knew that pushing too hard, too soon, might fracture the Northern coalition or alienate border states loyal to the Union but dependent on slavery. For months, the president weighed his options carefully, balancing moral conviction with political strategy. He needed a Union victory on the battlefield to justify the proclamation. Otherwise, it would appear as a desperate act, devoid of force. That opportunity came on September 17, 1862, at the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history. Though the battle was tactically inconclusive, it halted Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North and gave Lincoln the opening he had awaited. On September 22nd, just 5 days after Antietam, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. In his measured, resolute words, he declared that on January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in states still in rebellion against the Union shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. This was a declaration of freedom, but only in the rebellious territories, leaving slavery untouched in the loyal border states and areas already under Union control. The proclamation was a deliberate and calculated stroke. Lincoln understood that the war was about to enter a new phase, one that would test not only the armies, but the very soul of the nation. The proclamation reframed the conflict as a moral crusade, giving abolition a central place in the Union's war aims. It signaled to enslaved people that liberation was coming, and to the Confederacy, a clear message that their cause was increasingly isolated. The reaction was immediate and intense. Across the North, abolitionists hailed the proclamation as a righteous step toward justice, while many others viewed it with suspicion or outright hostility. Some feared it would prolong the war or incite unrest among border states. In the South, the proclamation was denounced as an illegal and incendiary act, further galvanizing their determination to fight. Yet, beyond politics and public opinion, the proclamation wielded a profound practical power. It allowed black men, formerly enslaved or free, to enlist in the Union Army and Navy. This changed the dynamic of the war in a fundamental way. By 1865, nearly 200,000 African American soldiers and sailors had served the Union cause, risking their lives on the front lines to claim their own freedom and reshape the nation's future. Their courage and sacrifice would become one of the war's most powerful legacies. The Proclamation also struck at the heart of the Southern economy. By declaring slaves in rebellious states to be free, it encouraged thousands to escape bondage and seek refuge behind Union lines, undermining the labor force upon which the Confederate war machine depended. This mass exodus of enslaved people, sometimes called the Great Flight to Freedom, created a new, volatile reality in the South, as plantation economies were destabilized and social orders challenged. Yet the Emancipation Proclamation was not the final word on slavery. It was in many ways a beginning, a crucial step toward abolition, but limited in its immediate effect. Slavery would not be formally abolished across the United States until the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December 1865. Still, Lincoln's proclamation set the moral compass for that journey and gave the Union a higher cause to fight for. For Lincoln himself, the proclamation was a moment of immense personal weight. Known for his humility and pragmatism, he did not frame it as a grand gesture, but as a necessary act of leadership amid unprecedented crisis. His speeches and writings reveal a man burdened by the cost of war, yet committed to justice, aware that the road ahead would be long and fraught with peril. The proclamation's unveiling also changed how the world saw the American conflict. European powers, especially Great Britain and France, had been considering recognizing the Confederacy, driven by economic interests and geopolitical calculations. But the proclamation's clear moral stance made such recognition politically untenable. It turned the war into a fight against slavery, a cause deeply unpopular with European publics, and effectively deterred foreign intervention on behalf of the South. On the ground, the proclamation inspired hope and determination among Union soldiers, abolitionists, and enslaved people alike. It shifted the stakes of the war, infusing it with a cause greater than the preservation of the Union alone. The fight was now to end centuries of bondage and redefine the meaning of American freedom. But the path was not smooth. The proclamation intensified Southern resistance, hardening attitudes and prolonging the conflict. It raised questions about citizenship, equality, and rights that would linger long after the last shot was fired. The battle over America's soul was far from over. Still, the power of Lincoln's pen that day stands as a testament to the impact that words, carefully chosen and boldly spoken, can have in shaping history. It reminds us that war is not only fought on battlefields, but also in the realms of ideas, ideals, and leadership. The Emancipation Proclamation changed the American Civil War, transforming it from a struggle over union and disunion into a righteous crusade for human liberty. It altered the course of the nation's history, setting it on a path toward greater justice, equality, and the hard work of reconciliation. In that single document, Lincoln gambled everything: his presidency, his party, and the fragile unity of a nation at war. But his gamble changed the fate of millions and redefined what it meant to be American. The pen, in that moment, proved mightier than the sword. Chapter 13. Freedom in Uniform. In the vast, tumultuous theater of the American Civil War, a transformation quietly took shape, one that would echo far beyond the battlefield, beyond the smoke and thunder of musket fire. It was a transformation, not only of strategy or politics, but of identity, dignity, and the very meaning of freedom. Black soldiers, once barred from service, began to march, not merely as warriors of a nation, but as bearers of a profound human hope, the hope for recognition, equality, and justice. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by President Abraham Lincoln after the Battle of Antietam, had opened the door. It was a door that thousands of African-American men stepped through, men who saw in the Union cause a promise that their bloodshed might finally bring the long-awaited end to slavery and the dawn of true citizenship. Yet this journey into uniform was neither simple nor universally welcomed. From the highest echelons of power to the muddy front lines, black soldiers faced skepticism, discrimination, and danger that went far beyond the battlefield. They fought not just against the Confederacy, but against prejudice within their own ranks. fighting for a country that had long denied their humanity. The first official units of black soldiers, the United States Colored Troops, or USCT, were formed in 1863. These regiments, numbering nearly 180,000 men by the end of the war, were composed largely of formerly enslaved men and free black citizens who volunteered with a fierce determination. They marched into battle with a cause that was deeply personal: freedom, not only for themselves but for their families and generations yet unborn. Training camps across the North buzzed with activity as these men, many for the first time in their lives, learned the art of war. Their drills, their discipline, their camaraderie forged a new chapter in American history. Yet, even as they drilled and marched, they contended with the harsh reality of unequal treatment. Pay was lower than their white counterparts. Opportunities for advancement were limited. Skepticism from white officers and soldiers was common. Despite this, their courage and resilience on the battlefield began to shatter stereotypes and force a reluctant respect. At Fort Wagner, South Carolina, in July 1863, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, one of the first black regiments, led a heroic charge. Though they suffered heavy losses, their valor was undeniable. Their sacrifice became a symbol of black military contribution and a powerful argument for equality. The stories from that battle and many others spread quickly, bolstering morale and inspiring more men to enlist. Black soldiers fought in nearly every major campaign, from the sweltering swamps of the South to the freezing winters of Virginia. They bore the same hardships, the same wounds, and for many, the same ultimate sacrifice as their white comrades. But their fight extended beyond enemy lines. Captured black soldiers faced a brutal reality. The Confederate government refused to recognize them as legitimate combatants, often treating them not as prisoners of war, but as escaped slaves or insurgents. Many were executed or sold back into slavery. This grim truth heightened the stakes of their service, making their courage all the more extraordinary. At home, the presence of black soldiers challenged deeply ingrained social orders. Their service questioned the very foundations of racial inequality that had persisted for centuries. Families and communities watched with pride and hope as sons and brothers donned uniforms, proving their loyalty and valor in ways that words alone could never capture. Their participation also shifted the broader narrative of the war. What had begun as a conflict over union and sovereignty was now irrevocably linked to the abolition of slavery and the recognition of black citizenship. The bravery of black soldiers made the cause of emancipation tangible, fought not only in speeches or proclamations, but in blood and sweat. Yet even as they marched forward, these soldiers and their allies knew the fight for equality would not end with the war. They marched for dignity, yes, but also for the promise of a nation that would finally live up to its ideals. Their service laid the groundwork for future struggles, for civil rights and justice that would span generations. The war's end brought both triumph and frustration. Black veterans returned home, hailed as heroes in some places, ignored or rejected in others. Many faced renewed discrimination, violence, and the harsh realities of Reconstruction. But their legacy endured, a testament to resilience, sacrifice, and the enduring pursuit of freedom. The story of black soldiers in the Civil War is a story of courage in the face of adversity, of hope that burned bright even amidst the darkest. Of times, they fought not only to preserve a nation but to redefine it, to make freedom a reality for all Americans. Their uniforms were more than fabric and buttons. They were symbols of a nation's conflicted conscience, of a people's unyielding spirit, and of a future yet to be won. Through smoke and fire, through fear and pain, black soldiers marched on, carrying with them the weight of history and the promise of liberty. In every cannon blast and every drumbeat, their footsteps echoed a truth that the war, for all its devastation, was also a crucible for change. The courage of these men transformed a divided nation and carved a path toward justice, a path that would continue to unfold long after the last battle was fought. Freedom in uniform was not just a chapter of the Civil War. It was a declaration that the fight for equality had found its voice, its strength, and its heroes. Chapter 14. Angels in Corsets and Combat Boots. As the American Civil War raged across battlefields from Virginia's rolling hills to the rivers of Mississippi, another kind of conflict was unfolding quietly but powerfully behind the lines. A conflict that challenged not only armies, but the very fabric of society. Women, long confined to prescribed roles, began to step into the fray in ways that would reshape the war effort and forever alter the place of women in American history. The image of the battlefield, smoke swirling, cannons booming, men locked in deadly combat, is etched deeply into our collective memory. But behind those scenes, women were performing a myriad of roles that were no less vital, no less heroic. They served as nurses, spies, soldiers, and supporters. They managed homes, farms, and businesses. They organized relief efforts and confronted the harsh realities of war with courage and resilience. In the beginning, many believed that a woman's place was strictly in the home, far from the horrors of the front lines. Yet the scale and brutality of the war shattered these illusions. As men marched off to fight, women were left to keep communities intact. They took on the burdens of agriculture, industry, and commerce, ensuring that supply lines remained open and families fed. But their contributions would not stop there. One of the most visible and transformative roles women embraced was that of the nurse. The war created a desperate need for medical care, wounds infected, diseases rampant, hospitals overwhelmed. Women like Clara Barton, who would later found the American Red Cross, traveled to the front lines with nothing but determination and compassion. With bandages, herbs, and an iron will, they tended to the injured, comforted the dying, and brought a semblance of humanity to the brutal theater of war. Nursing, once seen as unsuitable for women, became a battlefield of its own. These women faced squalid conditions, long hours, and the constant threat of disease. Yet their presence revolutionized wartime medicine, leading to improvements in sanitation, treatment, and hospital organization. Their work saved countless lives and laid the foundation for modern nursing in America. But women's contributions extended beyond caregiving. Many disguised themselves as men, cutting their hair and donning uniforms to enlist in the armies of both the Union and the Confederacy. Their reasons varied: patriotism, a desire for adventure, the hope of protecting loved ones, or simply the yearning for equality in a world that denied them a voice. These female soldiers, hidden in plain sight, fought in brutal battles, endured harsh conditions, and risked discovery every day. When uncovered, some were discharged, but many were celebrated for their bravery. Their stories challenged the traditional narratives of war, revealing a deeper complexity to the roles. Women played spies too became a vital force. Women's perceived innocence and access to social circles allowed them to gather intelligence, smuggle messages, and sabotage enemy operations. Figures such as Rose O'Neal Greenhow in the South and Harriet Tubman in the North used their wit and courage to influence the war's outcome in subtle but significant ways. The war also sparked changes on the home front. Women organized aid societies, raised funds, and coordinated the shipment of supplies to troops. They wrote letters, managed newspapers, and advocated for causes ranging from abolition to temperance. Their activism reflected a burgeoning sense of agency and public voice. Yet these acts of defiance and dedication came with profound personal costs: widows and orphans, families torn apart by loss, and the psychological scars borne by those who endured relentless hardship. These were the human costs borne largely by women. Their endurance underlined the war's reach far beyond the battlefield. The Civil War's upheaval shattered many long-held social norms. Women's expanded roles during the conflict challenged traditional gender expectations, planting seeds for future movements towards suffrage and equal rights. The war became a crucible in which the struggle for women's place in society was ignited alongside the struggle for the nation's soul. As the conflict drew to a close, the legacy of these angels in corsets and combat boots resonated deeply. Their stories of compassion, bravery, ingenuity, and sacrifice entered the national consciousness. They transformed the meaning of patriotism and expanded the definition of heroism. The war proved that courage was not the exclusive domain of men, that the strength to endure, to fight, and to heal transcended gender. Through their unwavering commitment, these women reshaped the American Civil War, and in doing so reshaped America itself. Theirs is a story of quiet revolution, a story of defying expectations, a story of hearts as fierce as cannons and spirits as unyielding as steel. It is a story that reminds us that history's greatest battles are often fought not only with weapons, but with courage, compassion, and an unbreakable will. Chapter 15. The South's Fragile Dream. The Confederate States of America. A name that conjures images of proud banners, gallant soldiers, and a desperate fight to preserve a way of life. But beneath the stirring rhetoric and the valor on the battlefield lay a fragile dream, one woven from contradictions, tensions, and vulnerabilities that would ultimately shape the destiny of a region and a nation. When the Southern states seceded, their leaders proclaimed a cause rooted in the defense of states' rights and the preservation of a distinct society. At its core, this cause was inseparable from the institution of slavery, an economy, a social order, and a culture deeply dependent on the labor of enslaved African Americans. The dream of independence was, in many ways, a dream to maintain this system. Yet this vision was fraught with complexity. The Confederacy was born out of a desire for self-determination, but it was also a patchwork of states with differing priorities and internal conflicts. Some sought a more rigid defense of slavery, others feared the consequences of war and economic upheaval. The unity that the Confederate flag symbolized often masked the fractures beneath. From the outset, the South faced monumental challenges. Its economy, overwhelmingly agricultural, relied heavily on cotton and tobacco, crops that demanded intensive labor. The planter aristocracy wielded immense power, but the vast majority of Southern whites were small farmers, artisans, and laborers who neither owned slaves nor fully shared the elite's vision. This disparity created tensions within Southern society itself. Moreover, the Confederate government struggled to balance the need for centralized authority with the fierce independence of its constituent states. The very principle of states' rights, which justified secession, also hampered the war effort. Governors and local leaders resisted conscription, tax collection, and centralized military command, undermining cohesion at critical moments. The Confederate Constitution, modeled closely on that of the United States, but with explicit protections for slavery, reflected these contradictions. It limited the power of the central government, even as the pressures of total war demanded unprecedented coordination. This tension weakened the Confederacy's ability to mobilize resources effectively. Military challenges compounded these political and economic struggles. The South's initial advantage in military leadership, with generals like Robert E. Lee and Thomas Stonewall Jackson, inspired hope. Yet the Confederacy faced an uphill battle against the industrial might, population, and infrastructure of the North blockades choked Southern ports, strangling trade and crippling access to weapons, ammunition, and supplies. Inflation soared as currency lost value, and shortages of food and medicine became commonplace. The hardships borne by soldiers and civilians alike eroded morale over time. Within this crucible, dissent simmered. Not all Southerners supported the Confederacy's cause. Unionist sentiment existed in pockets, especially in mountainous regions of Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia, where slavery was less entrenched. These communities endured persecution, imprisonment, and violence. For their loyalty to the Union, enslaved people themselves became an active force against the Confederacy. Many escaped plantations, seeking refuge behind Union lines, or joining the growing ranks of black soldiers fighting for freedom. Their resistance chipped away at the very foundation of the Southern economy and society. The Confederate dream was also tested by the question of leadership and political will. President Jefferson Davis, a seasoned politician and soldier, faced constant struggles to unify his government and people. His authority was challenged repeatedly by rival factions and local powers, complicating war strategies. As the war dragged on, the idealism that fueled secession gave way to the brutal realities of conflict: devastation of land, destruction of communities, and the staggering loss of life. The romantic vision of Southern independence collided with the harsh truths of modern warfare. Despite these fractures, Confederate soldiers fought fiercely, driven by loyalty to home, family, and their vision of a separate nation. Their bravery on battlefields like Gettysburg, Chickamauga, and the Wilderness cannot be denied, even as their cause unraveled. The South's fragile dream, ultimately, was a dream built on an unsustainable foundation, one that ignored the profound moral, economic, and political transformations sweeping the nation. It was a dream of a past that could not survive the present, and a future that remained painfully out of reach. In the end, the Confederacy's collapse was not only a military defeat, but the shattering of a social order. The remnants of this fragile dream would linger long after the last shot was fired, in the scars of Reconstruction, the rise of Jim Crow, and the ongoing struggle to reconcile the nation's divided history. This chapter of the American Civil War reveals a complex tapestry, a society grappling with its identity, ideals, and the stark realities of its own contradictions. The South's fragile dream was, in essence, a story of yearning and loss, of courage and conflict, and of a nation forever changed by the forces it sought to resist. Chapter 16, Fire from the Heavens. The town of Gettysburg, a quiet crossroads nestled in the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, would soon become the epicenter of a conflict unlike any the young nation had ever witnessed. Over 3 brutal days, this unassuming place would be transformed into a vast, hellish battlefield, where the fate of a nation, the very soul of America, would be tested by fire, blood, and thunder. It was July of 1863. The war had been raging for 2 long years, and the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, commanded by General Robert E. Lee, had pushed its way deep into Union territory. Lee's army sought not only to strike a decisive blow against the Union, but also to break the will of the northern states. A victory on Union soil, he believed, might force the North to the negotiating table and secure independence for the Confederacy. Opposing Lee was the Union Army of the Potomac, led by Major General George G. Meade, who had been appointed only days earlier. Meade, facing immense pressure, scrambled to intercept Lee's advance. What followed would become one of the most iconic and devastating battles in American history. The first day of fighting erupted almost by accident as Confederate forces encountered Union troops near Gettysburg. What began as a small clash quickly escalated into fierce combat. By day's end, the Confederates had pushed the Union forces through the town, but the Union soldiers had managed to secure strong defensive positions on the high ground to the south and west of Gettysburg. The calm before the storm was brief. The second day brought some of the fiercest and bloodiest fighting of the entire war. Across the fields and ridges, Little Round Top, the wheat field, Devil's Den, waves of Confederate troops charged against entrenched Union defenders. The Union soldiers, outnumbered in some places, held on with grim determination. Their steadfastness turned the tide again and again, but at a terrible cost. Casualties mounted. The earth was soaked with the blood of thousands, cries of pain and fury echoing across the landscape. The air was thick with smoke and dust, the scent of gunpowder heavy and suffocating. Soldiers fought not only with muskets and cannons, but with raw, desperate courage. On the third day, the climax of the battle unfolded, a moment forever, etched in history as Pickett's charge. Nearly 12,500 Confederate soldiers formed a massive line, advancing across open fields toward the Union center on Cemetery Ridge. They faced withering artillery fire, a hailstorm of bullets, and an unyielding defense. As these men marched men across that open ground, their fate was sealed. The charge failed spectacularly, resulting in devastating losses for the Confederacy. The shattered remnants of Lee's army retreated, their dream of victory on Northern Soil crushed beneath the fire from the heavens, Gettysburg was more than a battle. It was a turning point. The staggering losses, over 50,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, revealed the staggering human cost of the war. Families in both North and South received the grim news. Letters home carried tales of heroism, horror, and heartbreak. President Abraham Lincoln would later visit the battlefield, standing among the graves of the fallen, contemplating the enormity of what had transpired. From those solemn grounds, he delivered the Gettysburg Address, a brief, profound speech that redefined the purpose of the war. With words both simple and powerful, Lincoln invoked the principles of liberty and equality, reminding a weary nation that the struggle was for a new birth of freedom. The battle transformed the war from a fight to preserve the Union into a moral crusade to end slavery and ensure that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Gettysburg's fields remain sacred ground, a testament to sacrifice and the high price paid for a nation's future. The echoes of cannon fire, the courage of men who faced fire from the heavens, and the hope that sustained them through hellish days live on in the story of America's defining conflict. Here, in 3 days of unimaginable violence, the fate of a divided nation was forged anew, in blood, in loss, and in the indomitable spirit of those who fought to shape the course of history. Chapter 17. The Siege That Starved a City. In the sultry summer of 1863, along the winding banks of the Mississippi River, a city clung stubbornly to survival, a city whose fate would echo far beyond its battered walls. Vicksburg, Mississippi, a fortress, a symbol, and the linchpin of the Confederacy's control over the Mississippi River. Its capture would not only fracture the South, it would starve it, bleed it, and signal a turning tide in the war, or months. Union forces under the command of Major General Ulysses S. Grant had circled Vicksburg, determined to seize this strategic stronghold. The city's high bluffs overlooked the mighty river, giving Confederate defenders a commanding view and control of one of America's most vital waterways. Whoever held Vicksburg controlled the river, and by extension the flow of men, supplies, and commerce that kept the Confederacy alive. Grant's campaign was relentless, a masterclass in military strategy and endurance. After several failed attempts to capture the city directly, he settled on a siege, a war of attrition cutting off supplies and reinforcements, starving the city into submission. Inside Vicksburg, life became a grueling ordeal. Food supplies dwindled. The heat pressed down like a physical weight. Disease spread through crowded quarters. Civilians and soldiers alike endured the cruel uncertainty of starvation, the desperation of dwindling resources, and the ever-present thunder of Union artillery pounding their defenses. Mothers shielded their children from hunger's bitter bite, while soldiers held their posts with grim resolve, knowing the city's fate, and perhaps their own, hung in the balance. Day after day, the siege tightened like a noose, sapping strength, hope, and morale. The Confederates launched occasional sorties, daring attacks designed to break the siege, but the Union lines held firm. Grant's men dug trenches, built fortifications, and weathered counterattacks with a quiet tenacity. This grinding campaign was a war of patience and pressure, with each passing week eroding the South's will to resist. For the citizens trapped within Vicksburg's walls, the siege was a test of endurance and spirit. Their world shrank to a small, beleaguered city, isolated, hungry, and scarred by battle. The river that once brought life now symbolized blockade and defeat. As food became scarce, some resorted to desperate measures, consuming horses, rats, even mules to survive. The siege's psychological toll was as heavy as the physical deprivation. The constant roar of cannons, the deafening cracks of musket fire, and the ominous shadows of death loomed large. Families huddled in cellars praying for deliverance, even as hope flickered dimly. Meanwhile, the fall of Vicksburg was more than a local catastrophe. It was a strategic disaster that split the Confederacy in two. With the city under Union control, the Mississippi River opened fully to northern traffic, severing Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas from the rest of the South. This divide crippled the Confederacy's ability to move troops, weapons, and supplies. It fractured communication lines and sapped morale across the southern states. The Confederacy was bleeding out, and Vicksburg's fall was the wound that would not heal. When, at last, the city's Confederate commander, Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton, raised the white flag on July 4, 1863, the surrender marked a pivotal moment in the war. Grant's victory was decisive, hard-earned, and symbolic. It declared in no uncertain terms that the tide was turning irreversibly against the Confederacy. For the men and women of Vicksburg, surrender brought relief, but also the bitter weight of defeat. Their city lay battered, their lives forever changed. The siege had tested the limits of human endurance, the fragility of hope, and the harsh realities of war. Grant's triumph at Vicksburg, paired with the Union victory at Gettysburg a day earlier, marked a critical turning point. A moment when the Union's resolve was proven and the Confederacy's dreams began to unravel. The siege stands as a testament to the brutal nature of civil war, where battles are not won by grand charges alone, but by the slow, grinding pressure of determination, hardship, and strategy. It reminds us that war is as much about survival as it is about conquest. Vicksburg's fall echoed far beyond its embattled streets, signaling a fracture in the Confederacy's heart and a step closer to the eventual reunification of a nation, torn asunder. Here, amid starvation, sacrifice, and unyielding resolve, the story of America's great conflict was shaped, a story of endurance, loss, and the unforgiving price of a divided country striving to heal. Chapter 18. Hell Breaks Loose at Home. As the guns roared on distant battlefields, the tremors of war echoed far beyond the front lines. The American Civil War was not only a clash of armies, it was a conflict that tore through the very fabric of society, igniting unrest, hardship, and fury in towns and cities across the nation. Hell was breaking loose at home. In the summer of 1863, the streets of New York City, America's largest metropolis, erupted in chaos. What began as protests against the Union draft soon spiraled into one of the bloodiest urban riots in American history. For days, the city was engulfed in violence, fire, and destruction. The cause of this upheaval was the Enrollment Act, passed earlier that year, which mandated compulsory military service for men between the ages of 20 and 45. While the draft aimed to replenish Union forces, it exposed deep fault lines in Northern society, between the rich and the poor, between racial groups, and between the eager patriots and those who felt left behind. Many working-class New Yorkers, largely Irish immigrants, struggling to survive, in crowded tenements, viewed the draft as a cruel injustice. They could not afford to pay the $300 commutation fee to avoid service, while wealthier men escaped the battlefield by buying their way out. Resentment simmered, and the fault lines erupted. The draft riots began on July 13, 1863, just days after the Union victory at Gettysburg and the Confederate surrender at Vicksburg, events that should have united the North in celebration and resolve. Instead, anger and fear spilled into the streets. Rioters targeted draft offices, government buildings, and symbols of authority. But their rage soon turned even darker. African Americans, scapegoated as job stealers and threats to white labor, became victims of brutal attacks. Homes and businesses were burned, lynch mobs roamed, and the city seemed on the brink of collapse. The New York Police Department, overwhelmed and under-equipped, struggled to restore order. Federal troops, many fresh from battle, were called in to suppress the uprising. The violence claimed over 100 lives, injured thousands, and left parts of the city in smoldering ruins. Meanwhile, far to the south, the hardships of war were no less devastating, but they took a different shape. In Georgia, the Confederate home front buckled beneath the weight of blockades, shortages, and hunger. Food became scarce, prices soared beyond reach, desperation gnawed at families struggling to feed their children. Plantations that once thrived on the labor of enslaved people were now strained by the absence of men at war, the loss of supplies, and the ravages of conflict. Fields lay fallow, granaries emptied. Ordinary people, women, children, the elderly, bore the brunt of starvation and disease. The strains of war fractured communities and families. Loyalties were tested, patience worn thin. Riots and protests flared up in towns across the South, where citizens voiced their grievances against conscription, rationing, and government policies they believed favored the wealthy planter class over common folk. In both North and South, the Civil War revealed not just a military struggle, but a profound social upheaval. The nation was fighting a war with itself, a war that cut deep into the lives of every citizen, challenging the very notion of what it meant to be American. Families were torn apart. Fathers, brothers, and sons marched off to uncertain fates, while those left behind faced hunger, fear, and loss. The women who stayed home juggled impossible burdens, managing farms, businesses, and households under the shadow of war. The economic upheaval widened divides as inflation spiraled out of control in the South, and industrial workers in the North grappled with job insecurity and rising costs. Ethnic tensions, class resentment, and political factionalism festered, threatening the fragile unity required to sustain a nation at war. As these internal battles raged, political leaders faced mounting pressure. President Lincoln, navigating the storm, sought to hold the Union together, balancing harsh military measures with appeals to justice and reconciliation. But the unrest in cities like New York revealed the limits of control, the deep anxieties beneath the surface. In the South, Confederate authorities confronted their own challenges, desperate to maintain order while the war drained resources and morale. The Confederate government's increasing demands for men and supplies often met with resistance, fueling bitterness and disillusionment. Hell had indeed broken loose at home. The violence in New York, the hunger in Georgia, the unrest that gripped countless communities, all reflected the human cost of a nation torn apart by war. The battlefields were only one front. The war's reach extended into homes, streets, and hearts. The American Civil War was not only a contest of armies, but a crucible of society, exposing fault lines that would take generations to heal. The riots and shortages, the fears and fury, the courage and suffering. These were the hidden wars waged behind the headlines. As the conflict pressed on, the question remained: could a nation so deeply divided survive the storm it had unleashed upon itself? The answer would be written not only in battles won or lost, but in the resilience and reckoning of its people. Chapter 19, The Man Who Wouldn't Stop Bleeding. By the spring of 1864, the war had dragged on for nearly 3 years. The initial hopes of a swift conflict had faded into a grinding nightmare. Both sides had tasted victory and defeat, but the scale of destruction and loss had grown unimaginably vast. It was into this crucible of blood and fire that Ulysses S. Grant stepped forward, a man who would not relent, a man who would not stop bleeding the Confederacy dry. Grant's appointment as commander of all Union armies marked a turning point in strategy and resolve. Unlike his predecessors, who often retreated or avoided prolonged battles, Grant embraced a new kind of warfare, relentless, unforgiving, and unyielding. His plan was simple yet brutal: engage the Confederate forces constantly, wear them down by sheer force of will, and leave them no chance to regroup or recover. This was the Overland Campaign, a relentless series of battles across the Virginia wilderness, where every inch of ground was soaked in blood, and every advance came at an unimaginable cost. It was a war of attrition, where casualties mounted, like a tide that could not be turned back. In May 1864, Grant crossed the Rapidan River with more than 100,000 men, confronting General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. From the dense thickets of the wilderness to the open fields of Spotsylvania and the fortified lines at Cold Harbor, the fighting was savage and unrelenting. The Battle of the Wilderness erupted into chaos almost immediately. Trees and underbrush caught fire, turning the battlefield into a nightmarish inferno. Soldiers fought in smoke and confusion, the air thick with the stench of gunpowder and burning flesh. There was no clear victor, but Grant refused to retreat. Instead, he pushed forward, his eyes fixed on the objective, Lee's army. Next came Spotsylvania Courthouse, where the battle line stretched for miles, trenches and earthworks scarred the landscape. Here, the war turned into brutal trench warfare, hand-to-hand combat, volleys of musket fire, and the ceaseless pounding of artillery. The Union forces launched wave after wave of attacks, each one met with fierce Confederate resistance. The fighting was relentless. Men fell by the thousands, their bodies piled in muddy fields and shattered forests. Grant's losses were staggering, yet he pressed on. At Cold Harbor, the Union soldiers suffered one of the bloodiest assaults of the war. In a desperate attempt to break the Confederate lines, thousands charged across open ground, only to be met with a storm of bullets and cannon fire. The carnage was horrific. Many fell before reaching the enemy trenches. Despite pleas to halt the assault, Grant accepted the brutal cost, refusing to withdraw or change course. To many, this seemed madness, but Grant understood the cruel calculus of war. He knew that the Confederacy could not replace its losses. Its men, its resources were dwindling. The Union, with its larger population and industrial power, could endure the pain longer. The campaign was not a series of grand, decisive battles. It was grinding, exhausting, and relentless. Each day bled the Confederate army thinner. Each skirmish wore down their spirit. Grant's strategy was not to win in a single stroke, but to outlast, outfight, and outlast again. Behind the front lines, the toll was just as severe. Hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers, many suffering from infections and disease. Medical care was rudimentary and brutal, with amputations common and survival uncertain. Letters from the front spoke of pain, courage, and despair. The war was no longer a distant abstraction. It was a brutal reality that touched every family, every community. Grant himself was no stranger to hardship. Known for his quiet determination and steely resolve, he bore the weight of command with a grim acceptance. His decisions, though costly, reflected a deep understanding of the stakes. The Union must survive. The Confederacy must be broken. The Overland Campaign culminated in a siege around Petersburg, a city vital to the Confederate war effort. Here the nature of the war changed again, with trench warfare dominating the landscape. The stalemate dragged on for months, a war of attrition on a scale previously unseen in America. Throughout it all, Grant remained steady, the man who wouldn't stop bleeding the South dry, the relentless force pressing against the Confederacy's weakening heart. His campaign exemplified the brutal reality of the Civil War. That victory came at a terrible price, that endurance and sacrifice defined the struggle, and that in war there was often no glory, only the grim necessity to fight, to endure, and to prevail. This chapter of the war tested the limits of human endurance and courage. It reshaped the conflict into a brutal contest of wills, one where the cost was staggering, but the stakes nothing less than the future of a nation divided. Grant's Overland Campaign was a harsh, unyielding path to victory, a path marked by fire, blood, and the iron will of a man who refused to stop fighting until the war was won. Chapter 20. Burning Georgia. In the autumn of 1864, the war arrived at the doorstep of Georgia, and it came with a fury unlike anything seen before. Sherman's march to the sea was more than a military campaign. It was a deliberate, relentless strategy of total war, designed to break the Confederacy not just on the battlefield, but in its very soul. The march carried the flames of destruction deep into the heart of the South, bringing the brutal reality of war home to civilians and soldiers alike. Major General William Tecumseh Sherman, a Union commander known for his unyielding determination, understood that defeating the Confederacy required more than victory in pitched battles. It required destroying the South's will and capacity to fight, its supplies, its infrastructure, its spirit. His plan was bold: to march his army of some 60,000 men across Georgia, from Atlanta to Savannah, laying waste to everything that could sustain the Confederate war effort. The campaign began in November 1864, after the fall of Atlanta, a crucial industrial and railroad hub. Sherman's forces set out on a path of destruction, cutting a swath nearly 300 miles long and 60 miles wide. Towns, plantations, railroads, and farms were targeted, not just military objectives, but the economic lifeblood of the Confederacy. Sherman's troops tore up railroad tracks, twisting the rails into grotesque Sherman's neckties, rendering them useless for transport. Supply depots were burned to the ground. Barns, mills, and factories were reduced to ash. Crops were confiscated or destroyed. Livestock was seized or slaughtered. The land itself was weaponized against those who had waged war against the Union. This was not merely collateral damage, it was calculated, deliberate destruction, a harsh message that the South's rebellion had costs far beyond the battlefield. Sherman believed that by bringing the war to the civilian population, he could hasten the Confederacy's collapse and spare more lives in the long run. As the Union Army advanced, the people of Georgia faced a terrifying reality. Women, children, and the elderly witnessed their homes and livelihoods engulfed in flames. Families were uprooted, communities shattered. The familiar landscape of fields and forests transformed into a charred wasteland, marked by smoke, ruin, and the echoes of war. The march was not without hardship for Sherman's men either. They moved swiftly through unfamiliar territory, often facing guerrilla attacks and hostile civilians. But their discipline and determination held firm, their focus unshaken by the challenges. At every turn, Sherman's forces encountered the human face of war, refugees fleeing the destruction, families clinging to what little remained, Confederate soldiers trying to regroup and resist. The line between combatants and non-combatants blurred as the harsh realities of total war took hold. Sherman's march became a psychological as well as a physical blow. It shattered the myth of Southern invincibility and exposed the vulnerability of the Confederate heartland. The devastation demoralized soldiers and civilians alike, eroding confidence in the Confederate cause. When Sherman's army finally reached Savannah in December, the city surrendered without a fight. The march had achieved its goals. The destruction was complete, the Confederate supply lines severed, and the Union held a strategic prize on the Atlantic coast. But the true legacy of the March to the Sea went beyond military success. It forced a reckoning with the cost of war, the price paid by civilians caught in the crossfire, the moral complexities of targeting homes and livelihoods, and the brutal calculus of ending a conflict that had torn a nation apart. Sherman's campaign was a stark reminder that war is not confined to battlefields and soldiers. It reaches into towns and homes, into the lives of ordinary people whose only crime was living where history was being made. In burning Georgia, the Civil War transformed into a total war, a war without limits, a war that demanded sacrifices unimaginable in peace. It was a chapter of destruction and endurance, of sorrow and resolve, and a decisive step toward the war's ultimate conclusion. The march left scars on the land and on the nation's conscience, scars that would take generations to heal. Yet in the ashes of Georgia, the Union's victory grew clearer, its cause strengthened by the hard, unyielding realities of war. This was total war come home, a relentless march through fire and fury, a turning point in America's darkest conflict, and a vivid testament to the brutal price of division. Chapter 21. A graveyard called Petersburg. The year was 1864, and the war had entered a grim new phase, one that would come to define the relentless, grinding horror of the American Civil War. Petersburg, a modest railroad hub just south of Richmond, Virginia, became the stage for a siege unlike any the nation had seen. For nearly 10 months, from June 1864 to April 1865, this battlefield transformed into a sprawling graveyard, a landscape scarred by trenches, mud, blood, and endless death. It was here, in the tangled earthworks stretching for miles, that the hopes, fears, and endurance of both the Union and Confederate armies were tested to their absolute limits. The siege of Petersburg was not a dramatic, sweeping battle with clear lines and swift victory. No, it was a war of attrition, of endurance where time itself became the enemy. The conflict devolved into trench warfare, a brutal static struggle reminiscent of conflicts in Europe decades later. soldiers faced the agonizing reality of living in muddy trenches under constant threat of enemy fire, starvation, disease, and despair. For the Union, led by Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, Petersburg was the key to Richmond, the Confederate capital. Capturing Petersburg meant cutting off vital supply lines, starving the city of resources, and forcing General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia into submission. For Lee and his troops, holding Petersburg was a desperate necessity, the last bulwark between the Confederacy and total defeat. The siege began with fierce assaults and bloody engagements. Grant's forces launched repeated attacks against Confederate lines, hoping to break through. But Lee's army, though outnumbered and exhausted, held firm, digging deeper into the earth, fortifying their positions with intricate trenches, earthworks, and fortresses. The battlefield became a labyrinth of mud and barbed wire, with death lurking in every shadow. The soldiers, young men barely out of boyhood, lived in squalid conditions. The trenches were often waterlogged, filled with rats and lice. Food was scarce. Medical supplies were limited. The constant bombardment from artillery left scars on the landscape and shattered nerves. Each day was a battle for survival, not just against the enemy but against hunger, disease, and fatigue. Letters from the front reveal the grim reality. Soldiers wrote of sleepless nights, the stench of decay, the sight of fallen comrades left unburied. They spoke of hope fading like the last light of day, of prayers whispered in the dark, and of the terrible courage it took just to endure. The siege was punctuated by moments of savage combat, the Battle of the Crater being the most infamous. On July 30, 1864, Union troops detonated a massive mine beneath Confederate lines, creating a massive crater and opening what they hoped would be a path to victory. But confusion, poor planning, and fierce Confederate counterattacks turned the assault into a slaughter. Hundreds of Union soldiers died trapped in the crater, a scene of chaos and carnage etched into history. Beyond the battlefield, the civilian population of Richmond and Petersburg endured their own suffering. Food shortages, inflation, and the constant threat of bombardment turned daily life into a desperate struggle. Families faced the heartbreak of losing sons and husbands, while the once proud Confederate capital began to crumble under the weight of war. As winter gave way to spring, the siege wore down both armies. The Confederate lines, stretched thin and battered, could no longer hold back the tide. Supplies dwindled, morale plummeted, and desertions increased. The Union forces tightened their grip, cutting off escape routes and closing in on the city. The siege of Petersburg was not just a military confrontation, it was a profound test of human endurance. The men who fought there embodied the agony and determination of a nation torn apart. Their sacrifices were brutal and unrelenting, a testament to the terrible price of civil war. In April 1865, after months of siege and attrition, the Confederate lines finally collapsed. Grant's forces broke through, forcing Lee to abandon Petersburg and Richmond, signaling the imminent end of the Confederacy. The siege left behind a landscape of devastation, trenches scarred by gunfire, fields littered with the fallen, and towns shattered by the relentless conflict. But it also left a legacy of courage and resilience, a stark reminder of the human cost of a war that had consumed a nation. Petersburg was more than a battlefield. It was a graveyard, a crucible, and a symbol of the final desperate struggle for the soul of America. Chapter 22. The Night Richmond Burned. The night Richmond burned. It is a moment etched in the darkest chapters of American history, a fiery symbol of a nation tearing itself apart. The Confederate capital, once a proud, bustling city, now a city aflame, engulfed in smoke and chaos as the war's end drew near. It was a night of desperation, destruction, and undeniable reckoning. By early April 1865, Richmond had become a shadow of its former self. The city was surrounded, isolated, its defenses shattered after months of relentless siege at Petersburg. The Union armies, under General Ulysses S. Grant, had finally broken through the Confederate lines. The Confederate government, military, Leaders and thousands of civilians faced the grim reality. Their capital was lost. Inside Richmond, panic spread like wildfire. The Confederate leaders, realizing the inevitable, hastily prepared to evacuate. Civilians scrambled to gather what little they could carry: possessions, family members, memories. The city's streets filled with a mass exodus, a river of humanity fleeing a fate they could neither stop nor escape. But Richmond's fall was not quiet nor orderly. The Confederate military, in a desperate bid to prevent the Union from capturing supplies and infrastructure, set fire to warehouses filled with munitions, food, and cotton. The plan was to deny the enemy the resources, but the fires quickly grew beyond control. Flames leapt into the night sky, towering pillars of fire that illuminated the city in an eerie, hellish glow. Sparks and embers flew like deadly rain, igniting homes, businesses, and the wooden streets. The firestorm spread with terrifying speed, consuming blocks of the city. The cries of frightened residents mingled with the roar of the flames. Families trapped in the inferno fled into the dark, desperate for safety. The smoke choked the air, blurring vision and suffocating hope. Richmond was a city ablaze, a city burning not just with fire, but with the fury of a broken cause. The chaos. Confederate soldiers continued their retreat, crossing the James River as the city burned behind them. The government officials, including President Jefferson Davis, fled, their dreams of a separate nation collapsing in the smoke-filled night. Union troops approached the outskirts of Richmond at dawn, greeted not by a proud city, but by a smoldering ruin. The sight was both victory and tragedy, a symbol of the war's destruction, the cost of rebellion, and the agony of defeat. The fires burned for days, destroying vast sections of the city. Rebuilding Richmond would take years, and the scars of that night remained etched in the memories of those who lived through it. For many, the burning of Richmond was the final confirmation that the Confederacy was finished. The war, a conflict that had torn the nation apart for 4 brutal years, was in its last throes. The fall of Richmond and the night it burned were not just the end of a city, they were the end of an era, the death knell of the Confederate dream. The destruction was immense, the human toll staggering, but in the ashes lay the fragile beginnings of reunification and reconciliation. The night Richmond burned was a night of sorrow, loss, and reflection, a vivid reminder that the cost of division is paid in fire, blood, and shattered homes. It was a moment when a nation's soul was laid bare, a crucible from which a new America would eventually rise. Chapter 23. Surrender Without Shame. In the quiet town of Appomattox Courthouse on a crisp afternoon in early April 1865, 2 men met to end a war that had torn a nation apart. General Robert E. Lee, commander of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, and General Ulysses S. Grant, leader of the Union forces, sat down to negotiate surrender. It was not a moment marked by celebration or triumph. Instead, it was a solemn, heavy silence, a surrender without shame. For 4 long years, the United States had been engulfed in the most devastating conflict in its history. Brother had fought against brother, families had been divided, entire landscapes had been scorched by war. Yet in this small Virginia village, the war's brutal roar gave way to the quiet dignity of defeat and the first fragile steps toward healing. Lee's decision to surrender was not made lightly. The Confederate Army was exhausted, outnumbered, and starving. Richmond and Petersburg had fallen. The hope for a Confederate victory had faded like the last embers of a dying fire. Still, Lee carried the weight of his men's lives and the honor of their cause with deep conviction. When Lee rode to the meeting with Grant, he carried with him more than a sword. He carried the hopes and sorrows of a defeated South. Grant, aware of the magnitude of the moment, treated his counterpart with respect, an acknowledgement that, despite the bitter conflict, both men were patriots bound by a shared history. The terms of surrender were generous, reflecting Grant's desire not to humiliate but to reunite. Confederate officers were allowed to keep their sidearms. Soldiers were permitted to return home with their personal possessions and horses to rebuild their lives in a shattered land. The Union hoped to heal, not deepen wounds. As the two men signed the surrender documents on April 9, 1865, the war that had cost over 600,000 lives finally came to an end. The battlefield was silent, save for the quiet exchange of words between victors and vanquished, a sober recognition of loss and the beginning of reconciliation. The soldiers who laid down their arms did so with heavy hearts. For many, surrender was not defeat in spirit, but the painful acceptance of reality. The war had taken everything, homes, families, futures, yet in surrender there remained a flicker of hope. The aftermath of Appomattox was not filled with celebrations but with mourning. The nation faced the monumental task of rebuilding, of stitching together wounds too deep to be seen at a glance. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but the silence of surrender was a crucial first step. Lee's dignified capitulation set a tone for the South surrender that followed. Other Confederate armies soon laid down their arms, bringing the fractured nation closer to reunification. The war's violence gave way to the arduous process of peace. This moment at Appomattox was a testament to the resilience of a nation and the capacity of men to rise above conflict and bitterness. It was a surrender without shame, a recognition that sometimes true courage lies not in victory, but in the grace to accept defeat and move forward. The American Civil War was over, but its legacy, the lessons of sacrifice, division, and reconciliation, would echo through generations, shaping the very soul of the United States. Chapter 24. The Shot That Echoed Forever. The war was over. The guns had fallen silent. The armies had surrendered. But even as a weary nation began to breathe the fragile air of peace, a single shot would shatter that hope. A shot that echoed forever through the annals of American history. April 14, 1865, just 5 days after General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox, President Abraham Lincoln, the man who had steered the nation through its darkest hours, was assassinated in a Washington theater. A final casualty of a conflict that had already claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. His murder would leave a scar far deeper than any battlefield wound. The night had begun as a moment of respite, a chance for the president and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, to escape the burdens of war, if only briefly. Ford's Theater, bustling with laughter and light, was filled with hopeful spectators, eager for a distraction from years of bloodshed. The play, Our American Cousin, was a light-hearted comedy, a stark contrast to the tension gripping the Capitol. But in the shadows lurked John Wilkes Booth, a well-known actor and vehement Confederate sympathizer, whose hatred for Lincoln and the Union knew no bounds. Booth had conspired to shatter the fragile peace, to rekindle the flames of rebellion through a single brutal act. At approximately 10:15 p.m., as Lincoln sat in his private box, the sound of a pistol shot ripped through the theater. Booth fired a single bullet, striking the president in the back of the head. Chaos erupted instantly. The audience screamed, and Booth leapt from the box onto the stage, breaking his leg in the fall, before disappearing into the night. Lincoln, gravely wounded, was carried across the street to the Peterson house, where he would linger in unconscious agony for hours. Around him, doctors worked tirelessly, but the wound was fatal. On the morning of April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln took his last breath, the first American president to be assassinated, and a nation plunged into mourning. The assassination was not merely the loss of a leader, it was the violent, tragic punctuation, mark on a war that had devastated a nation. Lincoln had become a symbol of unity, hope, and the belief in a single, indivisible United States. His death threatened to undo the fragile progress toward healing and reconstruction. Across the country, news of the assassination spread like wildfire. The shock and grief were profound. Crowds gathered in silent tribute. Flags flew at half-mast. Yet beneath the sorrow simmered fear. Fear of renewed conflict, fear that the hard-won peace would unravel in the absence of Lincoln's guiding hand. The manhunt for John Wilkes Booth was swift and relentless. Over the next 12 days, Union soldiers pursued Booth and his co-conspirators across the countryside. The hunt ended on April 26, 1865, when Booth was cornered in a Virginia barn and killed. His violent spree finally brought to a close. Booth's conspirators were captured and faced trial. Many were sentenced to death or imprisonment, their plot condemned as the final desperate gasp of a defeated Confederacy. Lincoln's assassination also deeply affected the course of Reconstruction, the era of rebuilding and reconciliation that followed the war. His successor, Andrew Johnson, faced enormous challenges in reuniting a fractured nation. The president's death left a vacuum in leadership, complicating efforts to heal wounds and secure civil rights for millions of newly freed African Americans. For decades, historians, citizens, and poets would reflect on Lincoln's murder as more than a political tragedy. It was a profound human loss, the silencing of a voice that had spoken for liberty, justice, and the promise of a new beginning. The shot that echoed forever was not just a bullet fired in a theater. It was the shattering of a nation's innocence and the end of an era. Yet even in death, Lincoln's legacy endured, a beacon that would guide America through the difficult journey from division toward unity. The Civil War had claimed many lives, but none more symbolic than that of Abraham Lincoln, a leader whose vision for a united nation would continue to inspire long after the echoes of that fateful shot had faded into history. Chapter 25. The War After the War. The guns had fallen silent, the armies had surrendered, the Confederate flags were lowered, and the Union stood victorious. Yet, as the smoke cleared and the battlefield grew quiet, a new conflict emerged. A war of a different kind. It was the war after the war. The war to rebuild a fractured nation. The era known as Reconstruction. Reconstruction was not simply the act of rebuilding cities, railroads, and farms, though that was part of it. It was the painstaking, often painful process of stitching together a nation torn by 4 years of brutal civil war, a nation where old wounds ran deep, and where the meaning of freedom, justice, and equality were fiercely contested. The challenges of Reconstruction were immense. The South lay in ruin, its economy shattered, its social order overturned. For millions of formerly enslaved African Americans, freedom was a new, fragile reality, full of promise but also of peril. For many white Southerners, defeat brought bitterness, resentment, and fear of an uncertain future. The federal government, under the leadership of President Andrew Johnson after Lincoln's assassination, faced the daunting task of reuniting a nation deeply divided. Johnson's approach was lenient toward the South, seeking quick restoration of the former Confederate states without robust protections for newly freed African Americans. This leniency sowed seeds of conflict that would define the Reconstruction. Congress, dominated by radical Republicans, pushed for a more stringent Reconstruction, aiming to secure civil rights for freedmen and restructure Southern society. They passed the Reconstruction Acts, dividing the South into military districts and requiring new state constitutions guaranteeing black male suffrage before rejoining the Union. This period saw the ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments, extending citizenship and voting rights to African Americans. Yet these advances met fierce resistance. White supremacist groups, most notably the Ku Klux Klan, emerged in violent opposition to Reconstruction efforts, terrorizing freedmen, Republicans, and anyone who supported racial equality. Lynchings, intimidation, and voter suppression became tools of terror that undermined the fragile progress. In the South, the economy struggled to shift from slave labor to a system that was supposed to be free labor. Yet many African Americans found themselves trapped in sharecropping and tenant farming arrangements that perpetuated poverty and dependency. Land ownership, a key to true independence, remained out of reach for most. Political corruption, economic turmoil, and social upheaval marred the Reconstruction governments. Some Southern whites labeled these governments as illegitimate, fueled by what they called carpetbaggers from the North and scalawags, Southern whites who supported Reconstruction. This rhetoric deepened divisions and hardened attitudes. In the North, enthusiasm for Reconstruction waned as the years passed. Economic priorities shifted, and the country grew weary of the South's instability. The Compromise of 1877, a political deal that resolved the disputed 1876 presidential election, effectively ended Reconstruction by withdrawing federal troops from the South. This abandonment allowed white Democrats to regain control, ushering in the era of Jim Crow laws and segregation that would last for decades. Reconstruction was a time of contradictions, hope and heartbreak, progress and backlash, promise and betrayal. It was the beginning of a long, unfinished struggle for civil rights and equality. For the millions of African Americans, Reconstruction was the first taste of citizenship, the right to vote, to hold office, to own property, to seek education. Black men served in state legislatures and even in Congress. Black communities built schools, churches, and businesses. Yet this progress was met with violent resistance and legal maneuvering designed to roll back those gains. For white Southerners, Reconstruction was often seen as an occupation, an era of humiliation and loss. The old social order, grounded in white supremacy and slavery, was dismantled. This upheaval led to decades of racial violence and discrimination aimed at maintaining control through segregation and disenfranchisement. The war after the war exposed the deep fractures in American society, fractures not healed by the end of combat, but revealed in the struggle to define what it meant to be free, equal, and united. The legacy of Reconstruction is complex and enduring. Its successes laid the groundwork for the civil rights movements nearly a century later. Its failures left scars of inequality and injustice that the nation still wrestles with. The story of Reconstruction is a reminder that peace is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of justice. That rebuilding a nation demands more than physical repair. It requires the transformation of hearts, laws, and societies. The American Civil War ended on the battlefield, but its consequences echoed long after the last shot. The war shaped the course of American history, a testament to the resilience of a people striving to realize the promise of liberty for all. Chapter 26. Ashes and Echoes. The smoke had finally cleared. The cannons fell silent. The battlefield, once a chaotic maelstrom of violence and fury, now lay still, scarred, bloodied, and littered with the remnants of a war that had consumed a nation. The American Civil War was over, but America, that great young republic, would never be the same. 4 years of brutal conflict had left deep and lasting wounds. Over 600,000 souls had perished, far more than any other war in American history. Families were shattered, communities divided, and landscapes irrevocably altered. The cost of war was measured not only in lives lost, but in the soul of a nation torn apart by its own contradictions. From the ashes of this devastation rose a new America, a country forced to confront the darkest realities of its past and the profound challenges of its future. The war had settled the question of the Union's survival. It had ended the institution of slavery, forever altering the social and economic fabric of the nation. But it had also exposed deep fractures that would take generations to heal. The South lay in ruin. Cities like Richmond, Atlanta, and Charleston bore the scars of battle and fire. The plantations, once the pillars of a slave-driven economy, were shattered. The old order, built on the backs of enslaved millions, was gone, yet the struggle to replace it with justice and equality was only beginning. For the millions of newly freed African Americans, emancipation was a moment of profound hope, a chance to claim their rightful place as citizens, to pursue education, to build communities, and to live lives unshackled by bondage. Yet freedom was a fragile, incomplete promise. The road ahead was steep, marked by fierce resistance, systemic oppression, and the long, slow fight for civil rights. The Union's victory affirmed the idea that the United States was an indivisible nation, a single entity that no state could unilaterally leave. The principle of a unified republic was strengthened, but the war's brutal lessons lingered. Questions of federal power versus states' rights, economic inequality, and racial justice continued to challenge the republic. Politically, The Reconstruction era sought to rebuild and redefine the nation. New amendments to the Constitution abolished slavery, granted citizenship and equal protection under the law, and extended voting rights to black men. These were monumental steps toward a more inclusive democracy, yet they were met with fierce opposition, especially in the South. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged to violently resist these changes, seeking to restore the old racial hierarchy through terror and intimidation. Jim Crow laws would later cement racial segregation and disenfranchisement, creating a century-long struggle for civil rights that echoed the unresolved tensions of the Civil War era. Economically, the nation began a slow transformation. The industrial North surged ahead, while the devastated South struggled to recover. Sharecropping and tenant farming replaced slavery, often trapping African Americans and poor whites in cycles of poverty and debt. The promise of Reconstruction was incomplete, leaving many behind in the shadows of progress. The Civil War also reshaped American culture and memory. Monuments rose, stories were told, sometimes with reverence, sometimes with revision. Veterans from both sides carried the weight of their experiences, forming organizations to honor their comrades and preserve their version of history. The Lost Cause narrative emerged in the South, romanticizing the Confederate struggle and obscuring the realities of slavery and rebellion. Yet, despite the divisions, the war forged a new national identity, one that grappled with the ideals of liberty, union, and equality. The sacrifices made on battlefields from Gettysburg to Antietam, from Shiloh to Vicksburg, etched themselves into the American consciousness. The legacy of the Civil War is woven into the fabric of the United States, in its laws, its culture, its ongoing struggles for justice and equality. The echoes of the conflict resonate in the debates over civil rights, the meaning of freedom, and the very soul of the nation. Historians continue to study and interpret the war, seeking to understand its causes, its horrors, and its lessons. For every story of valor and sacrifice, there are stories of suffering and injustice. For every battlefield victory, there is the shadow of a fractured society. The American Civil War stands as a testament to the complexities of a nation striving to live up to its highest ideals. It is a story of division and reunion, of cruelty and compassion, of destruction and rebirth. As the nation moved forward from the ashes, it was clear that the war had not been an end, but a beginning, the start of an ongoing journey toward a more perfect union. In remembering the Civil War, we honor those who fought and died on both sides, and we reflect on the cost of division and the enduring power of reconciliation. The story of the Civil War is the story of America itself, a nation forged through conflict, tested by trial, and ever striving toward the ideals of liberty and justice for all. The echoes of that terrible conflict remind us that freedom must be fiercely protected, that unity must be carefully nurtured, and that the work of building a just society is never truly finished. From the ashes rose a nation, forever changed, scarred, but resilient. The Civil War was over, but its legacy would shape America forever.